In the stillness of the ocean's vast expanse, there are stories that drift silently beneath the surface, their answers lost to time. Some vanish in a matter of hours, others linger for decades, their mysteries growing with each passing year. What happened to the ships that disappeared without a trace, leaving only questions in their wake? From ghostly vessels found adrift with no crew, to vanished expeditions swallowed by the endless sea, the truth remains elusive, leaving behind only fragments of unsettling clues. As we venture into the depths of these eerie, unsolved maritime mysteries, you will step into the shoes of the investigators, piecing together the scattered remnants of these chilling disappearances, explore the fog-bound coasts where legends meet reality, and uncover the secrets of vessels that vanished as though they were never meant to be found. Each discovery raises more questions, each answer leads to another riddle in the shadows of the sea. The vanishing crew of the Mary Celeste. The brigantine. Mary Celeste entered the historical record in a manner that remains difficult to reconcile with ordinary maritime loss. In early December of 1872, the vessel was found adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, sailing under partial control of the wind, her course uncertain and her crew entirely absent. Nothing about her condition suggested the violence usually associated with abandonment at sea, and yet the absence of human presence felt immediate, as though it had occurred only moments before discovery. She had departed from New York Harbour on November 7, 1872, bound for Genoa, Italy, carrying a cargo of denatured alcohol, over 1,700 barrels packed tightly in her hold. Commanding the vessel was Captain Benjamin Briggs, an experienced mariner known for both discipline and caution, accompanied by his wife Sarah and their young daughter Sophia. The crew, selected with care, consisted of 7 men regarded as competent and reliable. Briggs himself was not only seasoned but deeply methodical, a captain with a reputation for prudence and religious conviction, making any decision to abandon a sound vessel all the more difficult to reconcile. The voyage began under ordinary conditions, with no record of unrest, illness, or concern during the ship's early progress across the Atlantic. Nearly a month later, on December 4th, the Mary Celeste was sighted by another vessel, the DEI Gratia, approximately 400 nautical miles east of the Azores. Captain David Morehouse, who knew Briggs personally, became concerned when he observed the brigantine's erratic movement. Her sails were partially set, some hanging loose, others strained awkwardly against the wind, with certain rigging lines found later to be slack or improperly handled. She neither responded to signals nor corrected her heading, drifting in a manner that suggested neglect rather than storm damage. A boarding party was sent across, and what they found did not resemble a ship overtaken by disaster. The deck showed no signs of struggle or destruction, and the hull remained intact, aside from minor water ingress in the lower compartments. When measured, the water in the hold amounted to roughly 3.5 feet, significant but not uncommon for a vessel of her type, and far from enough to threaten immediate sinking. The cargo was largely undisturbed, with only a small number of barrels later found to have leaked, their contents evaporating slowly into the confined space below deck. The ship's pumps were functional, and the vessel itself remained seaworthy, capable of completing its voyage under proper command. Inside the captain's cabin, the details became more unsettling in their restraint. Personal belongings were still in place, clothing neatly arranged, navigation instruments partially missing but not scattered. The ship's chronometer and sextant, critical tools for determining position, were absent, suggesting they had been deliberately taken. Yet other valuables, including money and jewellery, remained untouched. The logbook was present but incomplete, its final entry dated November 25th, placing the ship near the Azores more than a week before it was found, leaving a silent gap of 9 days during which the vessel continued moving without any recorded account of events. In the galley, the remnants of daily life lingered without explanation. Cooking utensils were set aside as if recently used, and no evidence indicated a prolonged interruption or chaotic departure. The crew's quarters revealed no signs of disorder, no overturned furniture, no personal effects hastily discarded. It was not the scene of panic, but of interruption, something that had compelled every person aboard to leave in a coordinated and seemingly voluntary manner. The lifeboat, however, was missing. This single absence suggested that the crew had not simply vanished into the sea without preparation, but had instead chosen, or been forced, to abandon the ship. The ropes used to secure the lifeboat appeared to have been cut or released in haste, though without the fraying or damage typical of violent severance. It implied urgency, but not chaos, as though the decision had been made under pressure, yet still with a degree of order. Weather records from the period indicate that the Atlantic crossing had been marked by rough conditions, though not extraordinary by maritime standards. Storms had passed through the region in late November, bringing heavy seas and shifting winds, but no known event severe enough to explain the complete abandonment of a seaworthy vessel. Nearby ships reported difficult navigation, but no catastrophic weather that might justify a sudden evacuation. Closer inspection of the vessel revealed smaller anomalies that, while individually minor, contributed to a growing sense of uncertainty. One of the forward hatch covers was reported to be slightly displaced, not torn away but loosened, as if opened and not fully secured again. This detail suggested that the crew may have inspected the cargo hold shortly before their disappearance, possibly reacting to something they believed was developing below deck. One detail that later drew attention was the condition of the cargo. The barrels of alcohol were constructed from red oak, a material more porous than white oak and capable of allowing vapours to escape over time. Some investigators proposed that fumes accumulating in the hold may have created a fear of explosion, especially if pressure had built beneath the partially opened hatch. In such a scenario, Captain Briggs might have ordered a temporary evacuation, intending to return once the perceived danger had passed. Yet no scorch marks, no signs of combustion, and no damage consistent with an explosion were found anywhere on the vessel. Another technical detail introduced further ambiguity. The sounding rod, used to measure water levels in the hold, may have been inaccurate or misread, potentially giving the impression that the ship was taking on far more water than it actually was. If Briggs believed the vessel to be in danger of sinking, even incorrectly, it could explain a decision to abandon ship under controlled conditions. Yet such a conclusion still depends on a chain of misjudgments, each one compounding into a final decision that left no opportunity for correction. The possibility of a misjudged emergency lingered as one of the more grounded explanations, but it failed to account for the complete absence of those who left. If the crew had boarded the lifeboat with the intention of remaining close, tethered perhaps by rope, then some trace of that connection should have remained. No such evidence was found. The sea had taken the lifeboat, and with it, any immediate clue to the crew's fate. Other theories emerged in the years that followed, each attempting to impose structure on a sequence of events that resisted clarity. Some suggested piracy, though the untouched cargo and valuables contradicted such a motive. Others considered mutiny, but Captain Briggs' reputation and the orderly condition of the ship offered little support for internal conflict. Even the notion of insurance fraud surfaced, yet no credible evidence ever substantiated deliberate deception or abandonment for financial gain. The legal proceedings that followed the ship's recovery further reflected the uncertainty surrounding the case. The DEI Greatia's crew, having brought the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, sought salvage rights, as was customary under maritime law. However, the British authorities, led by Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood, approached the case with suspicion. His investigation entertained the possibility of foul play, even implicating the salvagers without firm evidence. Despite extensive inquiry, no conclusion could be reached, and the court ultimately awarded a reduced salvage payment, citing lingering doubts that were never resolved. As time passed, the story of the Mary Celeste began to shift between documented fact and narrative embellishment. Sensationalized accounts introduced elements not supported by original records, meals left untouched on tables, cups of tea still warm, signs of sudden panic frozen in place. These additions, though compelling, obscured the quieter and more persistent mystery rooted in verified details. The truth, stripped of exaggeration, remained less dramatic but far more difficult to explain. What distinguished the Mary Celeste was not the presence of violence or disaster, but its absence. Ships had been lost before, claimed by storms, fire or collision, their wreckage scattered across the sea. Here, however, was a vessel that endured, continuing its passage without guidance, carrying with it the structure of routine and order, but none of the people who sustained it. The ship itself became a kind of record, an incomplete account of a decision made under uncertain conditions. The final log entry offered no warning, no indication of distress. It marked position and progress in the same measured tone used throughout the voyage. Whatever occurred after that moment unfolded beyond written record, leaving no testimony except the physical state of the ship and the absence it contained. The distance between the last entry and the point of discovery suggested days of drifting, time in which the vessel continued forward while its crew remained elsewhere, their fate unobserved. In the decades that followed, the Mary Celeste continued to surface in maritime discourse, not as a solved case, but as a reference point for the limits of explanation. Advances in navigation, communication and safety reduced the likelihood of similar events, yet none could retroactively illuminate what had occurred in 1872. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, retained whatever answer might once have been visible. The brigantine itself did not endure indefinitely. After changing hands multiple times, it was eventually wrecked off the coast of Haiti in 1885 under unrelated circumstances. By then, however, its place in maritime history had already been secured. The mystery was no longer tied to the vessel's physical existence, but to the unresolved question it left behind. No confirmed trace of Captain Briggs, his family, or the crew was ever found. No wreckage of the lifeboat surfaced, no bodies were recovered, and no definitive account emerged from passing ships or distant shores. The absence remained complete, resisting closure in a way that few maritime incidents have managed. What remains is a record defined as much by what is missing as by what was found: a seaworthy ship, a vanished crew, and a sequence of decisions that cannot be reconstructed. The Mary Celeste continued its journey without them, carrying forward a silence that has never been broken. And somewhere between the final entry and the empty deck, every voice aboard the Mary Celeste disappeared without leaving a single answer behind. The silent SOS of the SS Ourang Medan. A faint transmission crossed established maritime frequencies in the late hours of a routine watch, carrying words that immediately suggested something had already gone wrong, though no one could confirm where the message originated with absolute certainty. The signal itself was brief, fragmented, and yet unsettling in its clarity, as if the speaker had been aware of the conditions being described even as they unfolded. Before any vessel altered its course, the message itself had already begun shaping the narrative that would follow, spreading through naval and commercial channels as a report that resisted easy classification. Some accounts placed the transmission within the waters of the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest and most strategically significant shipping lanes in the world, where ships of all kinds regularly passed within close proximity, though not all reports agreed on the exact origin point. Operators who recorded the distress call later noted that the voice, though fragmented, maintained a strange and steady tone, one that did not carry the panic typically associated with emergencies at sea. The words were relayed in English, describing a situation aboard the ship that was already beyond recovery, and the final phrase, "I die," ended the transmission abruptly, without any follow-up or attempt to re-establish contact. The phrasing of the message suggested not confusion, but a measured awareness of conditions that were rapidly deteriorating, listing the deaths of officers and crew with an unsettling precision. Yet the lack of an identifiable call sign, registry or confirmed vessel name in the original transmission created a gap that would later complicate efforts to verify the story. Among the ships that received the signal, one vessel confirmed its intention to investigate the origin of the transmission, adjusting its course toward the reported coordinates as quickly as conditions allowed. Some accounts attribute this response to the American cargo ship Silver Star, though documentation varies, and not all maritime records provide consistent confirmation of the vessel involved. As the responding ship advanced toward the reported coordinates, no immediate visual confirmation of a target was available, and the surrounding sea remained undisturbed, offering no sign of wreckage or distress. Navigation under such conditions relied heavily on estimated positions, and in an era before modern tracking systems, locating a vessel based on a single transmission carried inherent uncertainty. When the crew finally came within range, the vessel in question presented no outward sign of the emergency that had been described, appearing intact and drifting without visible damage. The absence of external evidence made the reported distress even more difficult to reconcile, as there were no visible signs of collision, fire, or structural failure from a distance. Stepping aboard, the boarding party encountered a stillness that contrasted sharply with the urgency of the call they had followed, as though time itself had paused within the vessel's confines. Reports describe bodies found in various parts of the ship, including the bridge and lower compartments, their positions suggesting that death had occurred suddenly and without warning, though no immediate cause was identified. Inside the vessel, the condition of the crew introduced details that conflicted with any single simple explanation, as there were no clear signs of struggle or visible wounds. The positioning of the bodies, combined with the absence of defensive marks or widespread damage, led to speculation that whatever had occurred may have affected the crew simultaneously, though the mechanism behind such an event remained unknown. Further inspection revealed environmental factors that did not align with the apparent state of the ship's interior, with some accounts describing extreme heat despite the vessel being at sea under open conditions. This detail, if accurate, would introduce further complications, as it suggests a localized anomaly that did not correspond with typical maritime hazards. Attempts to stabilize the situation were cut short when a sudden and uncontrollable event forced an immediate evacuation, as the boarding party reportedly observed signs of fire emerging within the ship. With limited time to respond, the crew withdrew to a safe distance, prioritizing their own safety as conditions rapidly worsened aboard the vessel. In the aftermath, the ship itself was lost, taking with it the only physical evidence that might have clarified what had occurred, as it reportedly exploded and sank shortly after the fire began. Without the vessel available for detailed forensic examination, the ability to confirm or refute the initial observations was permanently removed. Attempts to stabilize the situation were cut short when a sudden and uncontrollable event forced an immediate evacuation, as the boarding party reportedly observed signs of fire emerging within the ship. With limited time to respond, the crew withdrew to a safe distance, prioritizing their own safety as conditions rapidly worsened aboard the vessel. In the aftermath, the ship itself was lost, taking with it the only physical evidence that might have clarified what had occurred, as it reportedly exploded and sank shortly after the fire began. Without the vessel available for detailed forensic examination, the ability to confirm or refute the initial observations was permanently removed. In the absence of the ship, the focus turned instead to the records that described its existence, though even these proved inconsistent across different sources. Maritime archives from the period do not contain a universally verified listing for a vessel named Ourang Medan, and this absence has fueled ongoing debate about whether the ship was ever formally registered. Attempts to verify the registration of the Ourang Medan produced no consistent or authoritative documentation, with some researchers suggesting that the name itself may have been derived from later retellings rather than official records. This lack of documentation distinguishes the case from many maritime incidents, where ship records, cargo manifests, and crew lists provide a foundation for investigation. Over time, the account began to circulate with variations that introduced uncertainty into even its most basic details, with different versions of the story appearing in publications across multiple decades. Some narratives describe the event as occurring in the late 1940s, though the exact date and location often shift depending on the source being referenced. Some explanations centered on the possibility of hazardous cargo releasing toxic gases into enclosed spaces, potentially affecting the crew before any visible signs of distress could emerge. Substances such as potassium cyanide have been suggested in speculative accounts, though no verified cargo manifest has been found to confirm this theory. Other interpretations suggested that the entire episode may have originated from a single, unverified report, later expanded and repeated across various sources until it became widely accepted as a maritime mystery. In this context, the story itself becomes part of the phenomenon, existing in a space between documented incident and collective retelling. What remained consistent across every version was the presence of a message that described events already concluded, a transmission that reported a scene it could no longer influence. That detail alone ensures that whether fully verified or not, the signal continues to carry a question that has never been fully answered. And what lingered beyond the last recorded transmission was not a conclusion, but a question suspended in the silence that followed. The disappearance of Flight 19 over open water. On December 5, 1945, 5 TBM Avenger aircraft lifted from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale as part of a routine navigation training exercise over the Atlantic. The flight, later known as Flight 19, began under clear operational conditions, with experienced naval aviators assigned to conduct overwater navigation practice that was considered standard for the era. From the beginning of the flight, the formation followed a planned route intended to test overwater navigation using standard compass headings and coordinated positioning. The aircraft moved eastward in a triangular training pattern designed to challenge pilots' ability to maintain orientation once coastal landmarks disappeared from view. As the aircraft moved eastward, radio contact remained active, with the lead pilot maintaining communication with ground control and issuing routine updates. These transmissions indicated nothing unusual in the early stages, suggesting that the flight was proceeding according to plan as it passed beyond the coastline and into open water. After several miles over open water, the pilots began reporting that familiar coastal reference points were no longer visible, leaving only instrument readings to determine direction. At this stage, the absence of visual cues became more significant, as the pilots relied increasingly on compasses that should have provided stable directional guidance. Within the early transmissions, the lead pilot expressed uncertainty about the aircraft's position, noting that the compass readings did not align with expected navigational outcomes. This initial discrepancy marked the beginning of a growing concern, as the instruments appeared to contradict the pilot's understanding of their heading. As the situation progressed, multiple pilots within the formation confirmed that their instruments appeared unreliable, each reporting similar discrepancies in heading and orientation. The consistency of these reports suggested that the issue was not isolated to a single aircraft, but instead affected the entire group simultaneously. Through continued communication, the flight attempted to adjust its course, though each correction seemed to introduce further disagreement between reported readings and perceived direction. Instructions were relayed between the aircraft, yet the responses indicated hesitation, as no pilot could confirm the accuracy of the proposed adjustments. At one point, the lead pilot instructed the formation to turn, yet responses from the group indicated hesitation, as no pilot could confirm the correctness of the proposed heading. This moment reflected a critical point in the flight, where decision-making became increasingly uncertain under conditions that challenged standard navigation procedures. By this stage, the flight appeared to have lost its established reference to land, relying solely on uncertain visual cues and conflicting instrument data over open ocean. The inability to confirm position created a situation in which each attempted correction risked further deviation from the intended course. Subsequent transmissions suggested that the group was no longer able to determine north from south, marking a critical breakdown in coordinated navigation among the aircraft. This loss of directional certainty signaled a deeper issue, as experienced pilots struggled to reconcile their instruments with their surroundings. With fuel levels becoming a growing concern, the pilots continued attempting to establish their location, though no consistent fix could be confirmed through either observation or instrumentation. The urgency of the situation increased as the available time to correct the flight path diminished. During one of the final recorded exchanges, the formation appeared to question whether they were over the Gulf of Mexico or still over the Atlantic, reflecting deep uncertainty in their positioning. This question highlighted the extent of the disorientation, as even the broader geographic context had become unclear. Shortly before communication ceased, instructions were discussed among the pilots, though the exact wording and intent of the final commands remain partially obscured in the recorded transcripts. The fragmented nature of these communications leaves gaps in the sequence of decisions made during the final moments of the flight. After the last confirmed radio contact, no further transmissions were received from any aircraft in the formation, and the flight disappeared without leaving a confirmed trace of its route. Despite immediate awareness that something had gone wrong, there was no precise location from which to begin a search. A rescue aircraft was dispatched to locate the missing flight, yet that plane also failed to return, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already unresolved disappearance. This second loss transformed the incident into something far more complex, as two separate aircraft vanished under similar conditions within a short time frame. Search efforts continued across a wide area of the Atlantic, involving multiple aircraft and naval vessels, though no definitive wreckage or conclusive evidence of the flight's final position was recovered at the time. The scale of the search reflected the seriousness of the incident, yet the ocean yielded no immediate answers. Official investigations later reviewed the available radio transcripts and flight data, concluding that the flight likely experienced severe navigational disorientation over open water Reports emphasized that the pilots had become lost during a training exercise, though the exact mechanism behind the loss of orientation remained uncertain. Subsequent analyses noted that weather conditions were reported as relatively stable, leaving questions about why experienced pilots were unable to re-establish orientation using standard procedures. This detail added to the mystery, as the absence of severe weather removed one of the most common explanations for navigational failure. Over time, discrepancies between recorded transmissions and later reconstructions of the flight path introduced additional uncertainty into attempts to precisely trace the final movements of the aircraft. Each reconstruction relied on limited data, leaving room for interpretation in how the events unfolded. In official records, the incident was ultimately categorized as an unexplained loss, with no definitive cause identified beyond the documented loss of navigational clarity and communication. The disappearance of both the original flight and the rescue aircraft ensured that no physical evidence could be recovered to confirm any single explanation. And as the final signals faded into silence over an unmarked stretch of ocean, the path they once followed remained untraceable beneath an expanse that offered no return. The ghost ship Carroll A. Deering. The schooner Carroll A. Deering was discovered grounded near Cape Hatteras on January 31, 1921, its sails still partially raised as though the vessel had only recently been in motion. When first observed from the shore and later approached by those tasked with inspecting it, the ship presented an image of continuity, rigging intact, structure undamaged, yet the absence of any crew immediately disrupted that sense of normalcy. From the vantage point of the first observers approaching the ship, the vessel presented an unsettling contradiction between its outward condition and the absence of any visible crew aboard. There were no signs of struggle on deck, no overturned equipment, and no immediate indication that a crisis had unfolded in a way that left behind physical evidence. Within the galley, investigators documented the presence of prepared meals left untouched, indicating a moment of interruption that had not reached its natural conclusion. Food had been set out as though the crew intended to return shortly, suggesting that whatever occurred did not follow the expected patterns of evacuation under prolonged threat. In the living quarters below deck, personal items were found in place, with no evidence suggesting that the crew had taken time to collect essential belongings before departing. Clothing, tools, and other personal effects remained behind, reinforcing the sense that the departure, if it occurred, was neither gradual nor methodical. On inspection of the navigation area, officials noted that key instruments were missing, including equipment necessary for determining the ship's position at sea. The removal of such tools stood in contrast to the otherwise orderly state of the vessel, introducing a contradiction between what was left behind and what was taken. According to Coast Guard documentation, the available logs and records aboard the vessel offered limited insight into the final movements of the crew, as critical entries were either incomplete or absent. Without a complete record, the sequence of events leading to the ship's grounding remained difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Near Cape Hatteras, the surrounding maritime environment was known for unpredictable currents and shifting weather conditions that had historically complicated navigation in the region. The area has long been recognised as a challenging stretch of coastline, where changing winds and water movement can influence a ship's course without immediate detection. At the time of the ship's discovery, weather reports described conditions that were unstable but not extreme enough to fully account for the abandonment of a functioning vessel. The absence of severe storms or catastrophic environmental factors left investigators searching for explanations beyond the immediate conditions at sea. One interpretation proposed during early discussions considered the possibility that the crew had encountered circumstances compelling enough to abandon the ship without completing routine activities. This line of reasoning focused on the suddenness implied by the prepared meal and the intact state of the vessel, though it did not provide a definitive cause. Another line of inquiry examined whether internal conflict among the crew might have influenced the sudden departure, though no physical evidence confirmed such a scenario. While the ship's condition allowed for speculation, the absence of clear indicators made it difficult to support any single theory with certainty. Within historical shipping records, the Carroll A. Deering appears as a typical commercial schooner, making its final condition an unexpected deviation from its documented purpose. Its presence in maritime registries contrasts sharply with the mystery surrounding its final voyage, which ends without a confirmed account of the crew's fate. During the official investigation, testimony from those who examined the ship highlighted inconsistencies between its preserved condition and the absence of any clear explanation for the crew's disappearance. These observations underscored the gap between what could be physically verified and what remained unknown. Further inspection of the vessel's structure revealed no visible signs of prolonged damage, suggesting that the ship itself had not sustained the type of destruction typically associated with maritime catastrophe. The lack of hull damage or structural compromise added to the difficulty of explaining how the ship was left in such a condition. As reports circulated through governmental and maritime channels, analysts began to consider broader scenarios that could account for both the orderly condition of the ship and the missing crew. These considerations extended beyond immediate physical evidence, drawing on patterns observed in other maritime incidents. In subsequent evaluations, investigators noted that no single piece of evidence provided a definitive explanation, leaving the case unresolved within the historical record. The combination of preserved order and missing presence created a tension that resisted resolution through standard, investigative methods, and the ship remained where it was found, its condition unchanged, while the absence of its crew left no clear point at which their departure could be traced. The SS Baychimo and the ship that would not sink. Amid the shifting pressures of Arctic navigation in the early 1930s, the SS Baychimo became trapped in sea ice during a commercial voyage, initiating a sequence of events that would outlast its intended purpose. The ship, operated by the Hudson's Bay Company, had been part of a supply route along the northern coast of Alaska, carrying goods meant for remote trading posts when the ice closed in with little warning, immobilizing the vessel in a landscape known for sudden and irreversible change. After the crew abandoned the vessel due to worsening ice conditions, the SS Baychimo was expected to be destroyed by the environment, yet early observations suggested otherwise. Before leaving, the crew removed what they could, but the ship itself remained behind, embedded in the ice near Barrow, its fate assumed to be sealed as temperatures and pressure continued to build around it. In the months that followed its abandonment, reports from the Arctic region indicated that the ship remained intact within the ice, defying expectations of rapid structural collapse. Traders and local observers who passed through the region described the vessel as still standing in place, suggesting that rather than breaking apart, the ice had held it in suspension, preserving its form longer than anticipated. Across the drifting ice fields, the SS Baychimo began to reappear in scattered sightings, each one placing the vessel farther from its original position. These sightings marked a shift from a stationary wreck to a moving object, as the ice itself carried the ship across vast and largely uncharted stretches of the Arctic Ocean. During one documented encounter, observers noted that the ship showed signs of surviving extended exposure, its form still recognizable despite the relentless Arctic conditions. The hull and deck were described as weathered but not destroyed, reinforcing the idea that the ship was not succumbing to the elements in the way most abandoned vessels would. As seasons changed, the vessel continued to move with the ice, with later reports placing the SS Baychimo in entirely new and distant locations. Its movement was not linear, but dependent on shifting ice flows, meaning each sighting represented a different moment in an ongoing, unpredictable journey. On several occasions, those who approached the ship found themselves unable to secure it, as shifting ice and unstable terrain disrupted every attempt. Crews attempting to board or salvage the vessel encountered conditions that changed rapidly, making safe access impossible even when the ship appeared within reach. Repeated salvage efforts were attempted, yet each time, environmental barriers prevented the SS Baychimo from being permanently recovered. Equipment limitations, weather conditions, and the instability of the ice ensured that any attempt to recover the vessel ended in retreat, leaving the ship to continue drifting without intervention. Throughout the 1930s, intermittent sightings by explorers and local travellers added fragments to the ship's ongoing movement across the Arctic. These records, though inconsistent, created a pattern that suggested persistence, with the vessel appearing and reappearing over time in different regions of the Arctic expanse. Over time, the SS Baychimo developed a reputation as a vessel that resisted retrieval, continuing its journey without a crew to guide or maintain it. Among Arctic communities and those familiar with the region, it became known not as a wreck, but as a drifting object that seemed to exist outside the normal outcomes of maritime loss. In certain instances, the ship appeared embedded within thick ice formations, making any extraction attempt both dangerous and impractical. These conditions were not constant, as the Arctic environment shifted, meaning that any opportunity to recover the vessel depended entirely on timing, resources, and unpredictable environmental alignment. Even decades after its abandonment, the vessel was still referenced in reports, suggesting that it endured far longer than anticipated. Occasional sightings continued into later years, with the ship appearing less frequently but still persisting in accounts that extended its presence beyond a typical maritime timeline. As Arctic exploration advanced, efforts to locate the SS Baychimo became more organised, though no confirmed recovery was ever achieved. Search efforts grew more sophisticated over time, but despite improved navigation and equipment, the vessel continued to elude permanent recovery. Within maritime records, the ship's prolonged presence raised questions about how long a vessel could persist when carried entirely by natural forces. Its survival became less about the ship itself, and more about the environment that sustained its movement, turning the Baychimo into an example of endurance shaped entirely by ice and time. Eventually, the trail of sightings thinned, and references to the ship became increasingly uncertain as it slipped beyond confirmed observation. With no definitive record of its final state, the SS Baychimo moved out of reach of documented history, leaving only fragments of its journey scattered across decades of Arctic reports. The last confirmed sighting did not conclude the ship's story, only the point at which it could no longer be traced with certainty. The Lost Patrol of USS Cyclops. In the context of early 20th century naval supply operations, a single collier assigned to transatlantic routes entered service with a role that would later intersect with one of the most unresolved disappearances in maritime history. The ship, later identified as the USS Cyclops, operated as part of the United States Navy's logistics network during a period when fuel and material transport were essential to wartime efforts, particularly as global conflict reshaped the demands placed on naval infrastructure. The vessel was part of the Proteus-class colliers and carried the hull designation AC-4, placing it among the largest naval colliers in service at the time, with a displacement exceeding 19,000 tons when fully loaded. Its size and cargo capacity made it a critical asset, but also meant that any structural or mechanical failure would have carried severe consequences given the weight it routinely transported. At the time of its final departure, the vessel later known as the USS Cyclops was carrying a full cargo of manganese ore, with its intended passage documented but never completed. The ship departed from the Caribbean in March 1918, bound for the United States, with its route passing through waters that were already known for shifting conditions and complex navigation challenges. Records indicate that the ship had made a stop at Barbados before its final leg, a standard practice for colliers operating in transatlantic supply chains, where resupply and route adjustments were often necessary depending on fuel consumption and operational demands. This stop has remained one of the last confirmed points in the vessel's documented journey. Based on available naval records, the ship was last reported somewhere along its route between the Caribbean and the United States, though the precise location of its final contact remains unverified. No further confirmed sightings were recorded after its departure, and the vessel effectively vanished from operational tracking without reaching its intended destination. Subsequent naval reviews noted that the Cyclops may have deviated from its expected route, though no official record confirms a significant course change. This uncertainty has complicated attempts to reconstruct its final trajectory, leaving only estimated paths rather than a precise navigational record. Without any recorded distress signal, the disappearance unfolded in a manner that removed the primary source of real-time information typically relied upon in maritime emergencies. This absence meant that no immediate alerts were issued, and no coordinated response could be initiated in time to establish what may have occurred in the ship's final moments. At the time, the vessel was equipped with wireless communication capabilities, and its crew was trained to send distress signals if necessary, yet no such transmission was ever logged. The absence of a radio signal remains one of the most significant gaps in the timeline, suggesting either a sudden event or conditions that prevented communication altogether. Following the ship's last known position, coordinated search efforts extended across a wide expanse of ocean, yet no confirmed debris or identifiable wreckage was recovered. Naval vessels and search teams canvassed the surrounding regions, but the ocean revealed no physical trace that could conclusively confirm the ship's fate or location. Search operations extended across known shipping lanes and surrounding waters, but no lifeboats, personal effects, or identifiable cargo were ever located, despite the vessel carrying heavy and distinct material that would typically be traceable in recovery scenarios. As these search operations continued, the absence of any physical evidence began to challenge standard expectations regarding the aftermath of large-scale maritime loss. Typically, even in severe conditions, ships of this size leave behind some form of debris, yet in this case the ocean remained unresponsive to extensive recovery efforts. Hydrographic conditions in the region, including strong currents such as the Gulf Stream, have been studied as possible factors that could disperse floating debris, though no model has successfully explained a complete absence of recoverable material at this scale. Review of communication logs revealed no final transmission, leaving investigators without a definitive endpoint from which to reconstruct the vessel's final movements. The lack of any recorded signal removed a critical layer of insight, placing greater emphasis on indirect data and leaving a gap that could not be filled through conventional means. Naval investigations later confirmed that no distress, partial or routine communication was logged in the final hours, reinforcing the possibility that whatever occurred may have happened suddenly or under conditions that prevented any form of signalling. Throughout the investigation, multiple environmental factors were examined, though none produced conclusive evidence linking them directly to the ship's disappearance. Weather conditions, sea state, and known hazards in the region were considered, but no single factor could be identified as the determining cause of the loss. Meteorological records from the period show no record of a major storm along the ship's route at the time, though the limitations of early 20th century weather tracking leave room for uncertainty regarding localized or unrecorded conditions. In comparison to other naval incidents, the case lacked both survivor accounts and verified eyewitness sightings, further limiting the available scope of reconstruction. The absence of any testimony from those aboard removed one of the most common methods of understanding maritime incidents, leaving only structural and environmental analysis as potential sources of insight. The crew of the Cyclops consisted of more than 300 personnel, and all were declared lost without a single confirmed survivor, making it one of the largest non-combat losses of life in United States naval history, without explanation or recovery. Over time, the persistence of no confirmed wreckage became a central feature of the case, distinguishing it from incidents where partial remains were eventually located. Even decades after the disappearance, searchers continued to produce no verified results, reinforcing the idea that the ship had not simply sunk in a conventional sense, but had vanished without leaving a traceable path. Efforts to locate the wreck have continued intermittently into the modern era, including sonar surveys and deep-sea mapping initiatives. Though none have produced any confirmed identification of the ship or its remains, among naval analysts, attention has often focused on cargo-related considerations, though no definitive causal connection has ever been established. The heavy load of manganese ore has been examined in relation to stability and buoyancy, but no conclusive evidence has confirmed that cargo alone could account for the vessel's disappearance. Manganese ore was strategically important during the war for steel production, which increased the urgency of its transport, yet its dense and shifting nature has continued to raise questions about how it may have affected the ship's handling under varying sea conditions. As decades passed, historical records continued to reflect the same absence of evidence, reinforcing the unresolved nature of the ship's fate. The case remained open in both formal and informal analyses, with each new generation revisiting the same unanswered questions without reaching a definitive conclusion. Within the broader context of maritime history, the disappearance remains notable for the complete lack of physical trace associated with its loss. Unlike other naval incidents where wreckage or partial remains provide clues, this case stands apart for the absence of any confirmed material evidence. Even with modern search capabilities, attempts to locate the wreck have not yielded verifiable results, leaving the case open-ended. Advances in sonar, underwater mapping, and ocean exploration have expanded the possibilities of detection, yet the final resting place of the vessel has never been confirmed. In official records, the incident continues to be cited as an unresolved maritime disappearance defined by the absence of both survivors and confirmed debris. Its classification reflects not only the scale of the loss, but also the limitations of investigation when no physical or testimonial evidence remains. No verified location has ever been established, leaving the final position of the vessel known only through the limits of what was never recovered. The strange fate of the MV Joyita. When a vessel is first encountered in an incomplete state, the MV Joyita emerges not as a disappearance, but as a scene already interrupted. In October 1955, it was found drifting in the South Pacific, its condition immediately suggesting that whatever had taken place unfolded without closure, leaving behind only partial evidence of what had occurred. The ship, partially submerged and abandoned, became one of the most studied maritime mysteries, not because of where it went, but because of what remained visible when it was found. Beneath the surface of its partially submerged hull, the condition of the ship revealed a sequence of details that suggested sudden abandonment rather than gradual decline. The vessel's deck was damaged, its upper structure exposed to water intrusion, yet its buoyancy remained sufficient to keep it afloat despite its compromised state. This balance between damage and survival introduced an immediate contradiction, where the ship had endured long enough to remain afloat, yet not long enough to maintain the presence of those aboard. Along the exposed structure and within the open compartments, the absence of normal operational indicators contrasted sharply with the presence of intact equipment and scattered provisions. The ship's cargo was found largely undisturbed, and essential items such as supplies and personal effects were still aboard, suggesting that departure was not the result of a planned evacuation. At the same time, critical navigational equipment was found missing, including components necessary for determining position at sea, which left investigators without a clear way to reconstruct the vessel's final course. Measured against typical maritime outcomes, the vessel's condition reflected an unusual divergence between damage and functionality that has remained difficult to reconcile. The Joyita was designed as a trading vessel, built to operate in regional routes across the Pacific, and its structure should have followed predictable patterns of failure if exposed to prolonged stress. Yet the evidence did not align with a single continuous cause, instead presenting a collection of signs that pointed in different directions without converging on a definitive explanation. Beyond the immediate state of the ship, records associated with its final voyage outline a route that was never completed, though the details remain anchored in incomplete documentation. The Joyita had departed from Samoa in late September 1955, carrying passengers and cargo toward the Tokelau Islands. Its intended journey was relatively short and familiar for vessels operating in the region, yet it never reached its destination, and no confirmed communication marked a turning point in its passage. Within those fragmented records, references to crew presence and expected operations begin to sketch a picture that does not fully align with the vessel's eventual condition. The ship was carrying a total of 25 people, including passengers and crew, none of whom were found aboard when the vessel was discovered. Their absence was absolute, leaving behind no confirmed survivors and no definitive explanation for how or when they departed the ship. Examined through available accounts, the transition from a functioning voyage to an abandoned vessel appears to lack a defining moment that would normally mark such a change. No confirmed distress signal was recorded, and no eyewitness account from other vessels definitively placed the Joyita in distress prior to its discovery. This absence of transitional evidence creates a gap where the critical moment of abandonment would typically be identified. Compared with standard maritime procedures, the absence of expected protocols and responses introduces a gap that cannot be explained through routine operational failure. A vessel encountering distress would typically attempt to communicate, signal for help, or leave identifiable markers of its condition, yet none of these elements were clearly documented in this case. The result is a record that moves directly from departure to discovery without a verifiable midpoint. From a structural and observational standpoint, the inconsistencies between what remained aboard and what was missing continue to define the central tension of the case. Some equipment was found operational, while other essential components were removed or missing entirely. This mixture of presence and absence has remained central to interpretations of the ship's condition, suggesting that the situation aboard was neither entirely catastrophic nor entirely controlled. Across subsequent analyses and revisitations of the site, the same unresolved elements persist without yielding a clear sequence that accounts for the ship's final state. Investigators examined possible causes ranging from mechanical failure to environmental conditions, yet no single explanation has been universally accepted. Each interpretation leaves certain details unaddressed, reinforcing the fragmented nature of the evidence. In the broader context of maritime history, the MV Joyita occupies a position shaped less by what happened at sea and more by what was left behind in its aftermath. The vessel's condition challenges conventional expectations of abandonment, where ships typically leave behind clearer indications of distress or damage. Instead, it presents a case where the absence of the crew and the condition of the vessel exist in a state of unresolved balance. Even as modern examination techniques have advanced, the preserved condition of the vessel continues to present details that resist straightforward categorization or explanation. Over time, the ship has been studied in relation to both historical context and structural behavior, yet its condition continues to defy a single cohesive interpretation. The physical evidence remains fixed, while the explanation for that evidence remains unsettled. Within official records, the documentation surrounding the vessel's condition remains consistent in its description, yet limited in its ability to account for the missing elements. Reports confirm what was found aboard, but they do not provide clarity on what occurred between the ship's departure and its discovery. This gap has persisted, leaving the recorded facts intact while the meaning behind them remains incomplete. Taken together, the physical evidence and recorded history form a framework that outlines the known facts while leaving critical gaps untouched. The ship's condition provides more questions than answers, and each detail seems to point toward a broader uncertainty that cannot be resolved through the available evidence alone. The result is a case defined not by what is known, but by how much remains unknown. When all available observations are considered, the vessel's condition remains defined by a balance between what is present, what is missing, and what cannot be confirmed. The unanswered signals of the SS Valencia. The SS Valencia departed from San Francisco on December 20th, 1905, bound for Seattle, carrying both passengers and cargo along a route that was already known to demand caution in winter conditions. What followed over the next several days would place the vessel at the centre of one of the most enduring maritime mysteries on the Pacific coast, though the earliest stages of the voyage itself appeared routine, marked by standard operations and a functioning crew. By the time the ship approached the northern waters off Vancouver Island, however, the sequence of events had begun to shift in ways that would later resist a unified explanation. Records of the SS Valencia's final voyage preserve a sequence of decisions and conditions that, when placed side by side, do not form a single coherent narrative. Reports from the ship indicate that the vessel encountered increasingly severe weather as it continued northward, with heavy seas and reduced visibility affecting both navigation and stability. These conditions, while not uncommon for the region and season, became significant when viewed alongside the decisions that were reportedly made on board as the situation developed. Accounts describing the ship's progress toward its destination differ in ways that prevent a clear reconstruction of when the situation began to shift beyond control. Some sources suggest that the vessel maintained its course for a considerable distance despite worsening conditions, while others indicate that uncertainty may have influenced the handling of the ship earlier than expected. This divergence in interpretation creates a gap in the timeline where the exact turning point remains unclear. Testimony collected from those who survived presents moments of clarity that are immediately followed by conflicting descriptions of the same events. Among the most consistent points across these accounts is that the ship encountered difficulty near the coast of Vancouver Island, in an area where navigation required precision due to submerged hazards and narrow passages. Yet even this shared understanding does not extend to the details of how the vessel ultimately came to its final position. Descriptions of lifeboat deployment vary not only in number, but also in timing, creating a division between what was reported and what was physically observed afterward. Some accounts describe multiple lifeboats being launched under difficult conditions, while others suggest that fewer boats reached the water than initially intended. The presence of lifeboats later found adrift or destroyed adds another layer to this uncertainty, as their condition did not always align with the expectations of a coordinated evacuation. Examination of the wreckage revealed structural damage that, while severe, does not fully account for the extent of the vessel's failure. The ship ultimately broke apart against the rocky shoreline near Cape Beale, a location where strong currents and exposed terrain contributed to the rapid deterioration of the hull. Despite this, the distribution of damage and debris suggests that the vessel may have experienced multiple points of stress rather than a single catastrophic impact. Some reports suggest that passengers and crew acted under organised conditions during the early stages of distress, while others indicate a rapid breakdown of coordination. This difference is particularly evident in descriptions of how individuals were directed toward lifeboats and how decisions were made in response to the worsening conditions. The inconsistency between these accounts leaves open the question of whether order or confusion defined the critical moments before the ship's final break. Statements gathered in the aftermath place emphasis on signals sent from the ship, yet those signals are interpreted differently depending on the source reviewing them. There are references to attempts at communication with shore stations, including distress signals that may have been received or partially acknowledged. However, the exact content and timing of these signals remain unclear, leaving uncertainty about how much information was conveyed before the vessel was lost. Surviving accounts of the final hours describe actions taken aboard the vessel that appear inconsistent when compared across multiple witnesses. Some narratives suggest that lifeboats were launched in response to immediate danger, while others indicate that environmental conditions made such efforts increasingly difficult to sustain. These differences do not negate one another, but instead exist in parallel, each preserving a fragment of what may have occurred without fully resolving the sequence. Later investigations attempted to reconcile the number of lifeboats with the number of people accounted for, but discrepancies remained unresolved. Several lifeboats were reported to have capsized or been lost at sea, and not all were recovered in a condition that allowed for clear conclusions about their use. This has led to continued uncertainty regarding how many individuals successfully escaped the vessel and how many were lost during the evacuation process. Fragments of narrative preserved in official reports suggest moments where decisions were made without consensus, leaving gaps in the recorded sequence of events. These gaps are not simply missing data, but represent points where different accounts diverge without a clear way to determine which version, if any, reflects the complete reality. The result is a layered record in which certainty exists only in isolated segments. Comparative analysis of witness accounts reveals patterns of contradiction that persist regardless of which version is examined more closely. These contradictions are not limited to minor details, but extend to fundamental aspects of the event, including timing, actions taken, and outcomes observed. Each attempt to reconcile these differences introduces new uncertainties, reinforcing the fragmented nature of the evidence. Attempts to reconstruct the final movements of the vessel rely on incomplete data, with certain elements repeated across sources but never fully confirmed. The path taken by the ship as it approached the coastline, the exact point at which it began to break apart, and the sequence of events leading to its final position all remain subjects of interpretation rather than established fact. This absence of resolution continues to define the case more than any single detail within it. Interpretations of the disaster vary depending on whether priority is given to survivor testimony, physical evidence, or official inquiry records. Each perspective offers a different lens through which the event can be understood, yet none of them provide a complete account on their own. The result is a collection of partial truths that resist consolidation into a single narrative. Across all available documentation, the information converges only in its ability to confirm that the outcome remains only partially understood. The SS Valencia was lost, and many of those aboard did not survive, yet the precise sequence of events that led to that outcome continues to exist in fragments rather than in full. Even now, a small inconsistency within the preserved accounts continues to resist explanation, remaining unresolved in every version that attempts to define it. The enigma of the Kaz II. When the Kaz II was first located drifting without a crew in April 2007 off the coast of Queensland, its condition immediately contradicted the expectations of a vessel operating under standard maritime practice. The yacht, a 9.8-metre catamaran, was found by a rescue helicopter during a search operation, and what stood out first was not damage or distress, but the absence of any visible human presence aboard. The discovery did not present itself as a scene of destruction, but rather as a functioning vessel that no longer appeared to have anyone controlling it. Running continuously at the time of discovery, the yacht's engine remained active despite the absence of any visible attempt to stop or adjust its operation. This condition alone placed the vessel in a state that would typically require intervention, yet no signs indicated that such intervention had occurred. The engine's continued operation suggested that whatever had happened aboard did not interrupt the vessel's mechanical systems in a conventional way. Inside the cabin, personal belongings were found arranged in a manner that suggested recent use, as though normal activity had ceased abruptly rather than gradually. Items such as clothing, food, and everyday equipment remained in place, creating the impression that the occupants had not intended to abandon the vessel. The presence of these items, undisturbed, introduced a contrast between expectation and outcome that would define the case. Navigation systems aboard the vessel retained an operational state that typically requires human oversight, yet no individual was present to manage or correct its course. The autopilot system, if engaged, would have maintained direction without direct input, allowing the yacht to continue along a path without immediate human control. This operational continuity raises questions about how long the vessel may have remained unattended before being discovered. Within the interior layout of the yacht, objects appeared undisturbed, maintaining positions that implied no forced movement or external disruption had taken place. The arrangement of items did not indicate signs of struggle or rapid evacuation, but rather a space that had not been abruptly altered by external forces. This condition stands in contrast to scenarios where distress typically results in disordered surroundings. At the moment responders boarded the vessel, the absence of any crew stood in direct contrast to the ongoing function of its mechanical systems. The helicopter crew that first spotted the yacht reported no signs of distress signals or visible damage from the air, further deepening the uncertainty surrounding the situation. When the vessel was approached more closely, the same contradiction persisted: a working yacht with no one aboard. Evidence from the engine suggests a prolonged period of operation, indicating that the vessel continued functioning independently of human presence for an extended duration. The implications of this detail extend beyond mechanical function, suggesting that the yacht remained underway or drifting under power for a time without intervention. This detail is central to understanding how the vessel moved prior to being found. Compared against standard maritime procedures, the observed state of the Kaz II presents deviations that do not align with expected protocols for an occupied and active vessel. Typically, vessels in distress exhibit clear indicators such as distress calls, equipment deployment, or visible damage, yet the Kaz II displayed none of these in a definitive way. Instead, it presented a combination of normal function and unexplained absence. Across multiple reports describing the vessel, the same core details reappear, yet they fail to converge into a single explanation that accounts for all observed conditions. Different accounts emphasize different elements, some focusing on the engine, others on the condition of the cabin, yet none provide a complete picture. The result is a collection of overlapping observations that resist full alignment. Inspection of safety equipment reveals that essential systems were present but not utilized, leaving their intended purpose unfulfilled at the time of discovery. Life jackets and emergency gear remained aboard, suggesting that if an evacuation occurred, it may not have followed standard procedures. This detail adds another layer to the question of how and why the crew was no longer present. Attempts to reconstruct the yacht's path rely on partial and indirect indicators, each offering limited insight into its movement prior to being found. The vessel was last reported near Great Keppel Island before drifting into open waters, but the exact sequence of its journey remains unclear. Without direct testimony from those aboard, reconstruction depends on interpreting physical and technical evidence alone. After the initial discovery, documentation of the vessel's condition emphasizes both its intact structure and the absence of any identifiable human presence aboard. The hull remained undamaged, and there were no signs of collision or external impact that could explain the disappearance of the crew. This preservation of structure contrasts with the absence of those who would normally occupy it. Official assessments consistently describe a vessel that remained operational in key respects, despite lacking the personnel required to maintain or intervene in its functioning. The continuity of the engine, combined with the absence of crew, creates a scenario where operation and abandonment exist simultaneously. This coexistence remains one of the central aspects of the case. Taken together, the available evidence outlines a scenario in which activity and absence coexist without a clear point of transition between the two states. The yacht did not appear to fail in a conventional sense, nor did it present signs of deliberate abandonment under clearly defined conditions. Instead, it remained in a condition that suggests something occurred between those two states without leaving a trace that can be fully understood. And yet, within the preserved accounts and technical observations, one condition aboard the vessel continues to appear unchanged, remaining present in every report without ever being fully explained. The disappearance of the HMS Atalanta. The HMS Atalanta disappeared into the Atlantic in January 1880, a training ship of the Royal Navy that had departed from Bermuda bound for Plymouth with a crew composed largely of naval cadets and instructors. Its purpose was not combat but instruction, an environment where discipline, seamanship and endurance were meant to be developed through extended time at sea under controlled conditions. The vessel itself represented a structured phase in naval training, one that relied on predictable routes, established communication expectations, and the assumption that ships would follow their intended course without interruption. Departure from Bermuda followed a familiar pattern used repeatedly by naval training vessels operating in the Atlantic, where routes were selected to balance exposure to open sea navigation with relative safety. The Atalanta's configuration reflected its role, carrying cadets who were still in the process of learning navigation, weather assessment, and ship handling under supervision. Every element of the journey was designed to reinforce instruction through repetition and exposure, yet the inherent unpredictability of the ocean remained a constant factor that could not be fully eliminated. As the ship progressed along its route, the absence of communication became the first indication that something may not have unfolded as expected. Naval procedures of the time depended on scheduled arrivals and the possibility of indirect updates through passing vessels or coastal stations. But once the Atalanta moved beyond those channels, it entered a space where only its own signals could confirm its status. When those signals failed to arrive, the situation transitioned from routine passage to uncertainty, though no immediate conclusion could be drawn. Yet time passed without confirmation of the vessel's position, and the initial response from naval authorities reflected a measured expectation that the ship might still be delayed by weather or navigational adjustments. However, as the delay extended beyond anticipated limits, concern shifted toward a more structured evaluation of possible outcomes. The absence of distress signals or wreckage complicated any attempt to identify a cause, leaving only speculation based on incomplete information. Weather conditions in the Atlantic during the period have been examined as a contributing factor, with references to storms and shifting atmospheric patterns that could have influenced navigation. Yet no single weather event has been conclusively linked to the ship's disappearance, and the scale of the ocean makes it difficult to isolate a specific incident that could account for the loss of an entire vessel without trace. The variability of maritime conditions ensures that even significant events can leave little lasting evidence once the sea has absorbed them. Search efforts were initiated across a wide area, extending along the ship's projected route and beyond, as naval authorities attempted to account for both drift and potential deviation. These efforts relied on the capabilities of the time, which were limited in comparison to modern search and rescue operations. Despite the scope of the search, no definitive remains of the Atalanta were recovered, and the lack of physical evidence prevented a clear reconstruction of the ship's final moments. In later accounts, isolated reports of debris or sightings were occasionally attributed to the vessel, though each claim carries uncertainty regarding its origin and reliability. Without consistent verification, these fragments remain ambiguous, offering possible but unconfirmed insight into the ship's fate. The absence of corroborating evidence leaves each report suspended between possibility and doubt, contributing to the enduring ambiguity surrounding the case. Historical analysis of the Atalanta has often returned to the same set of known facts: the ship's departure, its intended route, and the lack of any confirmed arrival. From these points, interpretations have been constructed that attempt to bridge the gap between expectation and outcome, though each theory must contend with the same fundamental limitation: the absence of definitive evidence. The structure of the case is defined as much by what is missing as by what is preserved. Within the broader framework of naval history, the disappearance of a training vessel carries particular significance, as such ships were not only transport but also platforms for instruction and development. The loss of the Atalanta therefore represents more than a single event. It reflects a moment in which the systems designed to train and protect naval personnel were themselves subject to failure under uncertain conditions. This intersection of purpose and outcome adds a layer of complexity to the case that continues to be examined. Subsequent reviews of naval procedures in the aftermath of similar incidents contributed to gradual changes in communication and monitoring systems, though these developments came over time and were not immediate. The Atalanta's disappearance served as one of several cases that highlighted the limitations of maritime coordination during the period, particularly in open ocean environments where visibility and contact were limited. Across all surviving accounts, the narrative of the HMS Atalanta remains incomplete, shaped by the absence of conclusive evidence and the limitations of the era's technology. Each attempt to reconstruct its final voyage must rely on inference rather than direct observation, leaving space for interpretation but not certainty. The ship itself, once part of a structured system of training and expectation, ultimately became an example of how even well-established procedures can fail under conditions that leave no clear trace behind. And still, within the fragments that remain, one element continues to exist without placement, as if it belongs to a moment that no record ever fully captured. The drifting mystery of the MV Alta. The MV Alta was first identified in 2018 as a vessel adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, its condition already shaped by an extended period without crew or active control. Its name would become associated not with a voyage in the traditional sense, but with a prolonged absence, an unmanned passage across a vast and shifting expanse of water that continued for more than a year before it reached land again. When the ship was eventually observed near European waters, it stood as an anomaly, a large, intact vessel moving without direction, carried entirely by the forces of wind and current. Observed from a distance, the MV Alta presented an unusual stillness against the movement of the Atlantic, as though it belonged to the water rather than moving through it. The vessel's structure remained recognizable as a cargo ship, yet its condition reflected the absence of maintenance or intervention over time. Paint worn by salt and exposure, surfaces dulled by constant contact with seawater, and subtle signs of structural strain all pointed toward a long interval at sea without human oversight. What remained most striking was not damage, but continuity. The ship had endured long enough to arrive in European waters without breaking apart. What first drew attention to the MV Alta was not its origin or departure, but the condition in which it appeared after months of drifting without a crew. By the time it was documented near the coast of Europe, its journey had already crossed a significant portion of the Atlantic, guided not by navigation but by environmental forces that rarely leave visible traces of their influence. Ocean currents, though invisible on the surface, exert a persistent directional pull that can carry large objects across entire ocean basins over time, shaping paths that are difficult to reconstruct in full. From the perspective of maritime observation, the MV Alta's presence in the Atlantic represented a deviation from expected patterns of vessel behaviour. Ships are typically tracked, guided, and accounted for through a combination of onboard systems and external monitoring. Yet this vessel moved beyond those frameworks. Its drift was not accompanied by regular reports or signals, and its position had to be inferred through periodic sightings and indirect confirmation. Each observation added another fragment to a timeline that remained incomplete. No immediate indication of human activity could be identified aboard the vessel when it was first encountered by authorities in 2018. The absence of a crew placed the ship into a different category of maritime concern, one that required evaluation not as an active vessel, but as an object influenced solely by external conditions. Without personnel to adjust course, maintain systems, or respond to emerging risks, the ship became dependent entirely on environmental forces that continued to act upon it without pause. Through the lens of ocean currents, the MV Alta's trajectory reflects the influence of forces that operate continuously, yet leave no permanent trace of their direction. The Atlantic is governed by large-scale circulation patterns, where currents can carry floating objects across thousands of kilometers over extended periods. While these currents are understood in broad terms, their interaction with wind, weather systems, and regional variations creates a path that is never entirely predictable. The ship's movement, therefore, cannot be reduced to a single route, but rather to a sequence of influences that accumulated over time. Years of exposure to open ocean conditions had altered the ship's exterior in ways that spoke more about time at sea than any recorded voyage. Saltwater, wind, and constant motion contribute to gradual changes in material integrity, affecting both visible surfaces and internal structures. Even without catastrophic damage, the environment imposes a slow transformation, one that is difficult to measure precisely, but evident in the cumulative effects observed upon inspection. The MV Alta's condition upon arrival reflected this process of prolonged exposure, with changes that developed incrementally rather than suddenly. Its structure, though weathered, remained sufficiently intact to suggest that the vessel had not suffered a catastrophic failure prior to its abandonment. This detail adds a layer of complexity to its journey, as it implies that the ship did not reach its drifting state through destruction, but through a different set of circumstances that removed it from active operation. The absence of a clear mechanical failure leaves open the question of how and why the vessel came to be without a crew in the first place. Efforts to secure or intervene with the drifting ship introduced a new phase in its journey, one defined by external contact rather than isolation. Once identified, the MV Alta became the subject of maritime response, as authorities and observers attempted to assess its condition and trajectory. Intervention in such cases often involves careful coordination, as a vessel without crew can still pose navigational risks if left uncontrolled near populated coastlines. The transition from open ocean drift to coastal proximity marks a shift in how the vessel is perceived, moving from an isolated object to one that must be managed within a more confined and sensitive environment. Analysis of its condition upon arrival in European waters reveals changes that accumulated gradually, shaped by prolonged exposure to salt, wind, and motion. These environmental factors do not act in isolation. Instead, they interact over time to produce effects that can alter both the appearance and structural integrity of a ship. The MV Alta's condition reflects this interplay, where each element of the environment contributed to its transformation during the period of drift. The absence of a crew shifted the vessel from a functioning entity into an object subject entirely to environmental forces. In this state, the ship no longer followed a planned route or responded to navigational inputs, but instead moved according to the combined influence of currents and weather systems. This transition highlights the difference between controlled movement and passive drift, where the absence of human intervention allows natural forces to define the outcome. Within the broader context of maritime history, the MV Alta occupies a position defined not by its construction or ownership, but by the duration of its uncontrolled passage. Unlike vessels that are lost suddenly, this ship remained in motion for an extended period, crossing significant distances without intervention. Its journey represents a sustained absence of control, one that continued long enough to leave a measurable but incomplete record of its movement across the Atlantic. Each phase of its drift can be understood as part of an extended interval in which no corrective action altered its course. From the moment it became unmanned, the ship entered a state where its path was determined solely by external conditions. This continuity, uninterrupted by human presence, distinguishes the MV Alta from cases where ships are lost abruptly or destroyed. Instead, its story is defined by persistence, by the fact that it continued moving unchanged in its fundamental state for a remarkable duration. What remains particularly notable is the way the vessel's path, though uninterrupted, defies precise reconstruction in its entirety. While its general movement can be inferred through known currents and sightings, the exact sequence of its journey remains partially obscured. This gap between known and unknown elements contributes to the enduring uncertainty surrounding its drift, leaving aspects of its passage open to interpretation. In the final assessment of its journey, the MV Alta presents not a sequence of events, but a continuous movement that resisted resolution until it met the shoreline. Its grounding in Ireland in 2020 marked the end of its unassisted drift, bringing it into contact with land after crossing the Atlantic without crew or active control. Yet even this conclusion does not fully account for the earlier stages of its journey, where the absence of direct observation leaves portions of its path unverified. And yet, despite all that is known about where it came to rest, the moment it first slipped into that long, unbroken drift still has no confirmed beginning. The SS Waratah and the ship that never returned. Along the shifting waters off the southeastern coast of Africa, where currents from distant oceans collide and winds gather without warning, a disappearance occurred that would resist explanation for more than a century. The early 20th century was an era of expanding maritime confidence, when steel hulls and steam engines promised reliability even across the most uncertain seas. Yet in July of 1909, one such vessel departed into those waters and never returned, leaving behind no wreckage, no confirmed sighting of its end, and no clear reason for its vanishing. The ship was the SS Waratah, and its absence would come to define one of the most enduring maritime mysteries of its time. Constructed in 1908 by the Barclay, Carroll and Company shipyard in Glasgow, the Waratah was a relatively new addition to the Blue Anchor Line's fleet, designed to carry both cargo and passengers between Britain and Australia. With a length of over 140 metres and equipped with modern amenities for its era, it was regarded as a vessel of both utility and comfort, capable of enduring long ocean voyages with a degree of stability that earlier ships could not offer. Its name, derived from a flower native to Australia, reflected the route it was meant to serve, a steady connection between continents. There was little in its design or early operation to suggest that it would soon become associated not with reliability, but with absence. By mid-1909, the Waratah had already completed several voyages without major incident, moving between London, Cape Town and Australian ports while carrying a mix of passengers, crew and commercial goods. Among those aboard were emigrants seeking new lives, returning travellers, and experienced seamen accustomed to long journeys across unpredictable waters. In early July, the ship departed from Durban, South Africa, bound for Cape Town, a relatively routine segment of its route. The distance was not excessive, and the coastline, though sometimes treacherous, was well travelled by vessels of the time. Nothing in the departure records indicated concern, yet there were small details, noted quietly at the time, that would later take on greater significance. Some passengers had reportedly expressed unease about the ship's behaviour in heavy seas during earlier parts of the voyage, describing a tendency to roll in a way that felt unusual for a vessel of its size. One account, later repeated in inquiries, came from a passenger who disembarked at Durban, claiming to have felt that the ship was top-heavy or unstable in certain conditions. These observations were not formally recorded as defects, and the Waratah continued its journey without delay, but they lingered in the background of what followed. After leaving Durban on July 26, 1909, the Waratah carried approximately 211 people, including crew and passengers, as well as a cargo that included lead and wool. It was last sighted on July 27th by another vessel, the Clan McIntyre, which reported seeing the Waratah in the distance, proceeding southward along the coast. According to that sighting, the ship appeared to be navigating normally, showing no visible distress. After that moment, it was not seen again. As days passed without the Waratah's arrival in Cape Town, concern began to grow. Communication at the time relied heavily on scheduled arrivals and sparse wireless transmissions, and the absence of a ship could take time to be recognised as significant. When it became clear that the Waratah was overdue, search efforts were initiated along the coastline, focusing on areas where wreckage might have drifted ashore. Ships were dispatched, coastal observers were alerted, and inquiries began among vessels that had travelled similar routes. Yet no debris, lifeboats or bodies were found. The ocean along that stretch of South Africa is influenced by the Agulhas Current, a powerful and often unpredictable flow of warm water that moves swiftly along the coast before turning back into the Indian Ocean. This current, combined with sudden storms and rogue waves, has long contributed to the region's reputation as hazardous for navigation. It was considered possible that the Waratah had encountered severe weather and succumbed quickly, perhaps capsizing or breaking apart in conditions that left little trace. However, even in such scenarios, it was expected that some form of wreckage would eventually appear along the shoreline. None did. In the weeks that followed, speculation intensified. One theory suggested that the Waratah had suffered a catastrophic structural failure, possibly related to its cargo shifting or to its reported instability. If the ship had rolled suddenly in heavy seas, it might have capsized with little opportunity for distress signals or evacuation. Another possibility involved an explosion within the cargo hold, though no evidence emerged to support this. The absence of wireless distress signals added to the uncertainty, as the ship had been equipped with communication equipment, though coverage in that region was limited. Efforts to locate the ship extended beyond immediate coastal searches. Inquiries were conducted with passing vessels, and reports of possible sightings were investigated, though none could be confirmed. One such report described a ship matching the Waratah's description, appearing to struggle in rough seas before disappearing into the horizon, but the reliability of this account remained uncertain. Without physical evidence, each theory remained speculative, unable to fully account for the complete disappearance. Over time, the Waratah came to be referred to as the Titanic of the Southern Seas, though the comparison was more reflective of its mystery than of any known similarity in its fate. Unlike the more widely documented disaster that would occur 3 years later in the North Atlantic, the Waratah left behind no definitive narrative of its final moments. There were no survivors to recount what had happened, no wreck site to examine, and no confirmed timeline beyond its last sighting. In the decades that followed, multiple attempts were made to locate the ship's remains. Advances in marine technology allowed for more extensive searches of the ocean floor, particularly in areas where the Waratah was believed to have travelled. Several expeditions focused on sections of the seabed off the South African coast, guided by historical records and oceanographic data. Despite these efforts, no confirmed wreckage of the Waratah was found. Objects discovered during these searches were either unrelated or could not be conclusively linked to the missing vessel. One of the more persistent challenges in locating the Waratah lies in the nature of the ocean floor in that region. The seabed is uneven and complex, with deep trenches, shifting sediments, and strong currents that can disperse debris over vast distances. Even a large vessel could become difficult to detect under such conditions, particularly if it sank intact and settled in a location not previously surveyed. This possibility has kept the search alive in some circles, though the passage of time has made definitive answers increasingly elusive. The human dimension of the disappearance remains equally unresolved. Families of those aboard were left without closure, relying on incomplete information and the slow fading of official inquiries. The lack of physical evidence meant that no clear cause of loss could be established, leaving the event suspended between known risk and unknown circumstance. In maritime records, the Waratah is listed simply as missing, a designation that reflects both the limits of knowledge and the persistence of uncertainty. What distinguishes the Waratah's story is not only the scale of its loss, but the completeness of its disappearance. In many maritime disasters, even those occurring under sudden and violent conditions, some trace remains: a fragment of hull, a lifeboat, a signal received too late. In this case, the sea offered nothing in return. The route between Durban and Cape Town remained active. Ships continued to pass along the same waters, and yet the space where the Waratah vanished yielded no sign that it had ever been there. Modern interpretations often return to the question of stability, revisiting the early accounts of unusual rolling and considering how cargo distribution and ship design might have interacted under severe weather conditions. These analyses suggest that a combination of factors, structural characteristics, environmental forces, and perhaps a moment of imbalance could have led to a rapid and unrecoverable event. Still, without direct evidence, these remain reconstructions rather than conclusions. The passage of more than a century has not diminished the sense of absence surrounding the Waratah. If anything, it has deepened it, as each unsuccessful search reinforces the idea that the ship's final position may lie beyond the reach of current knowledge. The ocean, vast and largely unexplored in many regions, continues to hold its secrets with a consistency that defies expectation. In this context, the Waratah becomes less an isolated incident and more a reflection of the limits inherent in maritime exploration. Even now, occasional expeditions revisit the possibility of discovery, guided by improved mapping technologies and refined search methods. Each attempt carries with it the quiet expectation that some trace might finally be found, that a piece of the puzzle might emerge from the depths, yet the outcome has remained the same, and the narrative of the Waratah continues without resolution. The last confirmed image of the ship remains that distant sighting on July 27th, a vessel moving steadily along its course, unaware of the speculation and absence it would leave behind. Beyond that moment, the record ends, replaced by conjecture and the enduring silence of the sea. And somewhere beneath those shifting waters, or perhaps scattered beyond recognition, the final moments of the Waratah remain unobserved, suspended in a part of the ocean that has never given them back. The tale of the Octavius and the frozen crew. Far beyond the reach of familiar shipping routes, the Arctic Ocean presents a landscape where silence, ice, and distance obscure even the most substantial traces of human passage. In these northern waters, where horizons dissolve into pale light and frozen surfaces shift without warning, the record of human movement has often been incomplete or entirely absent. It is within this environment that one of the most enduring maritime legends is said to have unfolded, a story not preserved through official logs or verified reports, but through repetition and quiet persistence. The tale concerns a vessel known as the Octavius, and a discovery that has never been conclusively confirmed. According to accounts that surfaced years after the supposed event, a whaling vessel encountered a ship locked within the ice, its sails slack and its movement long arrested. The discovery is often placed in the late 18th century, though no contemporary documentation has been found to support a precise date. The vessel was reportedly adrift yet fixed in place, surrounded by frozen water that had sealed it into stillness. Those who claimed to have boarded it described an absence of activity that suggested not abandonment, but interruption, something that had halted life aboard the ship without leaving visible signs of struggle. During the 18th century, voyages into Arctic waters were marked by incomplete maps, shifting ice fields, and a persistent uncertainty that made even short distances unpredictable. European interest in finding a navigable Northwest Passage had intensified during this period, driven by the promise of a direct trade route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Expeditions ventured into increasingly hazardous regions, often without accurate knowledge of currents, seasonal ice behaviour, or the limits of their own vessels. Ships could become trapped without warning, held in place by ice that expanded and contracted with the changing temperatures, sometimes for entire winters. Descriptions of what was found aboard the vessel, later identified in the story as the Octavius, focus on a stillness so complete that it seemed untouched by time. The crew, it is said, were discovered where they had last been at work or rest, preserved by the cold conditions that dominated the surrounding environment. The captain was reportedly found seated at his desk, with papers still before him, as though the act of recording the voyage had been interrupted mid-sentence. These details, repeated across variations of the story, form its most striking elements, yet they remain unverified, existing only within the accounts that recount them. No verified shipping records, port entries or official logs have been found to confirm the existence or final voyage of a ship bearing that name under those circumstances. Maritime registries from the period, while not entirely complete, contain no clear reference to an Octavius undertaking such a journey or failing to return. This absence complicates any attempt to treat the account as a documented event, placing it instead within a category of narratives that are remembered without being recorded. The lack of primary evidence does not disprove the story, but it prevents it from being anchored to a specific historical framework. Attempts to navigate the Northwest Passage during that era often resulted in ships becoming trapped for months or years, their crews exposed to isolation, cold, and dwindling supplies. Historical expeditions provide numerous examples of vessels immobilized by ice, their progress halted indefinitely as conditions deteriorated. In such circumstances, survival depended on limited provisions and the hope of eventual release, neither of which could be guaranteed. The possibility that a ship might remain frozen long after its crew had perished is not beyond consideration, given the known behaviour of Arctic conditions. The story itself appears to emerge not from contemporary documentation, but from later retellings that circulated through maritime communities and published anecdotes. It has been repeated in various forms, sometimes with minor alterations, yet always retaining the same central image of a ship preserved in ice, discovered long after its final voyage should have ended. The persistence of these details suggests a narrative that has been shaped through transmission rather than observation, accumulating familiarity without gaining verification. Over time, the line between report and retelling becomes less distinct. Ice in the Arctic does not remain fixed, and vessels caught within it can be carried vast distances over extended periods without any active navigation. Ocean currents beneath the ice exert a slow but continuous influence, shifting entire fields of frozen water across regions that span hundreds of miles. A ship immobilized within such a system could drift far from its original position, emerging in an entirely different area after months or even years. This movement introduces a degree of plausibility to the idea of a vessel being discovered long after it was lost, though it does not confirm the specific details of the Octavius account. What remains uncertain is not whether such preservation is possible, but whether this particular account reflects an actual event or a narrative shaped over time. The environmental conditions described in the story align with known characteristics of the Arctic, where low temperatures can slow decomposition and maintain the appearance of stillness. At the same time, the absence of corroborating evidence raises questions about how such a discovery could have occurred without leaving a trace in official records or first-hand reports. The balance between these possibilities sustains the ambiguity that defines the tale. Stories like that of the Octavius persist in part because they exist at the edge of what can be proven, sustained by the absence of definitive contradiction. In maritime history, especially in regions where observation was limited and survival uncertain, such narratives often fill the spaces left by incomplete documentation. They provide a form of explanation that is neither fully accepted nor entirely dismissed, occupying a position that allows them to endure without resolution. The Octavius, whether real or imagined, has come to represent that space, and somewhere within that expanse of drifting ice and unrecorded history, the line between a vanished ship and a remembered story remains impossible to fully trace. The disappearance of the MV Derbyshire. Typhoons do not arrive as singular events, but as vast systems of pressure and wind capable of overwhelming even the largest vessels at sea. Their formation begins far from sight, building across war-motion surfaces until the atmosphere itself becomes unstable, producing waves that rise beyond predictable limits. In September 1980, one such system would intensify into what became known as Typhoon Orchid, moving across open water with a force that could not be directly measured from within its path. It was within these conditions that a modern cargo ship disappeared, leaving behind no immediate trace and no final transmission. The vessel was the MV Derbyshire, and its loss would remain unresolved for years despite the scale of both the ship and the search that followed. Built as one of the largest British bulk carriers of its time, the Derbyshire represented a scale of engineering intended to withstand the demands of long-distance trade. Completed in 1976 and operated by Bibi Lin, the ship measured over 290 metres in length and was designed to transport large quantities of raw materials across extended routes. Its structure consisted of a series of cargo holds sealed by heavy steel hatch covers, built to contain dense cargo such as iron ore. Vessels of this type were considered robust, their size often interpreted as a form of security against the uncertainties of the open ocean. There was little reason to expect that such a ship could be lost without warning. In September 1980, the vessel departed on a routine voyage carrying iron ore, following a route that would bring it into the path of a developing storm system. The Derbyshire had loaded its cargo in Canada before setting course for Japan, a journey that would take it across the Pacific. Weather forecasts at the time indicated the presence of a typhoon forming ahead, and while such conditions were not unusual for ships operating in the region, they required careful navigation. Communication records indicate that the ship altered its course in response to the storm, attempting to avoid the most severe conditions while continuing toward its destination. Contact with the ship ceased without the transmission of a distress signal, leaving behind a silence that stood in contrast to the severity of the conditions it was known to have encountered. The final message received from the Derbyshire did not indicate immediate danger, and no subsequent communication suggested escalating distress. This absence of warning would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, as it implied that whatever occurred did so rapidly, leaving no opportunity for the crew to respond or report their situation. Initial explanations remained uncertain, shaped by limited data and the difficulty of determining how a vessel of such size could disappear so completely. Early theories considered the possibility of structural failure, cargo imbalance, or mechanical malfunction, though none could be confirmed without physical evidence. The conditions within a typhoon, including extreme wave heights and intense pressure variations, were acknowledged as potential factors, yet the exact sequence of events remained unknown. Without survivors or debris, the incident could not be reconstructed with any degree of certainty. Search operations faced immediate constraints, as the depth of the ocean in the suspected area limited the possibility of locating physical evidence. The region where the Derbyshire was believed to have sunk lies thousands of meters below the surface, beyond the reach of conventional recovery methods available at the time. Aircraft and ships searched for floating debris, but none was found. The absence of wreckage reinforced the perception that the ship had been lost quickly and completely, leaving little behind to guide investigators. Years passed without resolution, and the loss of the Derbyshire became defined less by what was known than by the absence of confirmation. For the families of the 44 people aboard, the lack of answers created prolonged uncertainty that extended beyond the initial event. Official inquiries provided limited conclusions, constrained by the lack of evidence and the technological limitations of the period. The ship's disappearance remained recorded but unexplained. Decades later, advances in deep-sea exploration led to the eventual discovery of the wreck on the ocean floor. In the 1990s, a series of expeditions used sonar and remotely operated vehicles to locate the remains of the Derbyshire at a depth of approximately 4,000 metres. The wreck was found in multiple sections, scattered across the seabed in a pattern that suggested a violent structural failure. For the first time, investigators were able to examine physical evidence of what had occurred. Examination of the site revealed a pattern of structural failure that suggested the ship had broken apart under extreme stress. The forward section of the vessel showed signs of collapse, with hatch covers displaced and internal structures exposed. This damage indicated that large volumes of water had entered the cargo holds, compromising the ship's buoyancy. The scale of the damage pointed toward forces consistent with severe storm conditions, though the exact trigger for the failure required further analysis. Investigators reconstructed a sequence in which massive waves and pressure compromised critical sections of the vessel, particularly the forward structures. It was concluded that repeated wave impacts may have damaged ventilation pipes or hatch covers, allowing water to enter the forward holds. As water accumulated, the weight would have increased rapidly, placing additional strain on the ship's structure. This process, once initiated, could have progressed quickly, leading to a loss of stability and eventual breakup. The reconstruction provided a plausible explanation, though it remained based on interpretation rather than direct observation. The findings prompted changes in maritime safety standards, even as they relied on analysis rather than direct observation of the event itself. Investigations into the Derbyshire's loss contributed to improved design requirements for bulk carriers, particularly regarding hatch cover strength and structural integrity under extreme conditions. These changes reflected an effort to prevent similar incidents, drawing lessons from a disaster that had only been understood years after it occurred. Despite these conclusions, the precise experience of the crew during those final moments remains beyond documented record. No account exists of how the ship responded in real time, how quickly the situation deteriorated, or what actions were taken in response. The reconstructed sequence provides a framework, but it cannot fully capture the reality of the event as it unfolded within the storm. In the end, the Derbyshire's story exists as a convergence of delayed evidence and irreversible loss, shaped by what could only be understood after the fact. The ocean concealed the event in the moment it occurred, revealing its details only years later through fragments scattered across the seabed. What emerged from that discovery was not a complete narrative, but a partial understanding assembled from the remains. What was learned from the ocean floor explained the mechanism of the loss, but not the moment it was lived. The phantom lights of the SS Zabrina. Under wartime conditions at sea, visibility, identification and certainty were often reduced to the limits of what could be seen and verified in a single moment. Naval restrictions, dimmed lighting, and the constant awareness of potential threats shaped how vessels moved and how they were perceived, particularly along routes where civilian and military traffic overlapped. In such an environment, even a brief sighting could carry significance, and any irregularity might be noted with caution or, at times, uncertainty. It was within this atmosphere that the SS Zabrina became part of a story defined less by what was recorded and more by what was reported. Operating as a barge rather than a conventional cargo ship, the SS Zabrina was designed for transport along coastal routes, where larger vessels were less practical. Barges of this type were typically used to carry goods in bulk, often in conjunction with other ships that would tow or guide them across sections of water. Their function was utilitarian, their movements often routine, and their presence in maritime records was usually unremarkable unless something interrupted their expected course. The Zabrina, by design, was not a vessel associated with mystery, yet its name would later become attached to one. Before any uncertainty entered the record, the Zabrina followed a route that placed it within expected maritime activity during a period marked by restricted movement. During wartime, coastal navigation required adherence to protocols intended to minimize risk, including adherence to designated routes and reduced visibility measures. Ships often travelled at night or under conditions that limited exposure, and communication between vessels was tightly controlled. These constraints, while necessary, also reduced the number of observable details that could later be verified. Accounts describing the moment of its discovery consistently note that the vessel appeared intact, with its cargo still secured and no crew present aboard. This detail forms the central point of the mystery, as the condition of the ship suggested that no immediate catastrophe had occurred at the time it was last observed. The cargo, reportedly untouched, indicated that loading and transport had proceeded normally up to a certain point. Yet the absence of crew introduced a break in that continuity, leaving no explanation for how or when the vessel had been abandoned. Among the most unusual elements reported in relation to the Zabrina are references to lights seen on or near the vessel at a distance. These accounts describe illumination that appeared inconsistent with the surrounding conditions, drawing attention from observers who may have been navigating nearby waters. In maritime settings, lights serve practical purposes: navigation, signalling, identification. But under wartime restrictions, their use could also be limited or altered. The presence of lights in such accounts introduces a layer of ambiguity, as it is not always clear whether they belong to the ship, another vessel, or were perceived under conditions that affected visibility. Conditions at sea during wartime often limited visibility through enforced blackouts, nighttime navigation, and reduced signalling between vessels. These measures were intended to prevent detection and reduce the risk of engagement, but they also altered how ships appeared to one another. In low-light conditions, even familiar objects could take on unfamiliar characteristics, and distant lights could appear isolated or detached from their source. This environment made precise identification more difficult, particularly when observations were made at a distance or under limited time. Official records and investigative reports from the period provide limited confirmation of the sightings, leaving many details reliant on individual accounts. In cases where documentation is sparse or incomplete, later interpretations must rely on the available evidence, which may not fully capture the original circumstances. This creates a gap between what was observed and what can be verified, a gap that becomes more significant in cases involving maritime activity during wartime, when record-keeping could be interrupted or deprioritized. Descriptions of the Zabrina's cargo suggest that it remained undisturbed, a detail that complicates attempts to reconstruct what occurred. Cargo that remains in place implies that loading was not interrupted by sudden movement or violent impact, or at least not in a way that displaced the contents. This observation stands in contrast to the absence of crew, raising questions about the sequence of events that led to the vessel being found in that condition. The combination of intact cargo and missing personnel forms a contradiction that has not been resolved through available records. Similar reports of abandoned vessels have appeared throughout maritime history, particularly in periods of conflict where documentation was inconsistent. Ships found adrift, damaged, or without crew are not uncommon in the broader record of naval and commercial activity. However, each case carries its own set of circumstances, and the Zabrina's account remains distinct in the specific combination of reported conditions. Placing it within a broader historical context highlights that, while such incidents are not without precedent, their explanations are often as varied as the conditions under which they occurred. Human perception under low visibility and high tension can influence how distant or partially obscured objects are interpreted at sea. The combination of darkness, restricted lighting, and the vastness of the ocean can create conditions where details are inferred rather than clearly observed. In such situations, the mind may attempt to complete what cannot be fully seen, leading to interpretations that later become part of the recorded account. This does not negate the accounts themselves, but it introduces a factor that must be considered when evaluating their reliability. What remains constant in accounts of the Zabrina is the absence of a definitive explanation for the condition in which it was found. The vessel appears in the record as intact, yet empty of crew, with no single event identified as the cause of that state. This lack of resolution leaves the story suspended between observation and interpretation, where each detail contributes to the overall uncertainty rather than resolving it. Over time, the details surrounding the vessel have persisted without convergence into a single confirmed narrative. Different accounts emphasize different aspects, yet none fully resolve the central question of how the ship came to be in that condition. The passage of time has not clarified the mystery, but instead allowed the various elements of the story to exist alongside one another without contradiction or resolution. In the quiet intersection between what was seen and what could be verified, the story of the Zabrina continues to exist without resolution. It remains defined not by a single explanation, but by the accumulation of observations that have never fully aligned. And in that unresolved space, the question remains whether the lights were part of the ship, or only part of what was seen. The loss of the HMS Erebus and Terror. Amid the mid-19th century's most ambitious Arctic aspirations, a British expedition set its course into the uncharted polar corridors, carrying the weight of national expectation as well as the silent uncertainty of what lay ahead, including the eventual disappearance of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. The mission, led by Sir John Franklin and approved by the Admiralty, was intended to chart the final unknown stretches of the Northwest Passage, a route that had eluded navigators for generations and yet carried immense strategic and commercial promise. Both ships, already proven in Arctic service, were outfitted with reinforced hulls and steam engines adapted from railway locomotives, a detail that reflected the confidence placed in technology as a means of overcoming nature's resistance. The crews departed with provisions believed sufficient for several years, including preserved food and advanced supplies intended to sustain them through the harshest conditions. Nothing in the early records suggested the voyage would end differently from those that came before, though the Arctic itself held no obligation to confirm those expectations. Within the frozen stillness of the Canadian Arctic, the ships advanced into waters that, for most of the year, resisted passage with thick ice and shifting pressure ridges that would soon test both vessels beyond their design limits. In 1845, the expedition was last sighted by European whalers in Baffin Bay, before proceeding into the labyrinth of islands and channels that define the Canadian Arctic archipelago. After that brief encounter, no further written communication reached the outside world, leaving only speculation about their movements as they pushed deeper into the icebound expanse. The region itself is defined by extreme seasonal cycles, where darkness dominates for months and ice expands into solid, immovable barriers capable of trapping even the strongest vessels. It was within this environment that the expedition would encounter conditions far more persistent and unforgiving than anticipated, conditions that would ultimately determine the trajectory of both ships. From the moment the expedition vanished from recorded communication, scattered fragments of evidence began to emerge in later years, each one offering only partial insight into the final movements of the crew and their ships. Initial search efforts launched by the British Admiralty yielded no immediate answers, though they did uncover the first signs that something had gone drastically wrong. Messages left in cairns, stone markers used by explorers to leave records, provided limited but critical information, including a report that both ships had become trapped in ice. One such note, dated April 1848 and discovered years later, indicated that the ships had been abandoned after prolonged entrapment and that many crew members had already died. The note also described plans for the remaining men to attempt an overland journey towards safety, a decision that would lead them into one of the most unforgiving terrains on Earth. On King William Island, objects later discovered by search parties revealed traces of human presence, including preserved materials and equipment that suggested the crew had attempted to endure conditions far beyond what their provisions could sustain. Among these discoveries were relics such as cutlery, clothing, and ship fittings scattered across the landscape, each item marking the slow dissolution of order as the situation grew increasingly desperate. The remains of boats, sometimes modified or abandoned mid-use, indicated attempts to travel over ice or open water, suggesting that survival had required constant adaptation to an environment that shifted unpredictably. The presence of these artifacts across a wide area implied movement over time, rather than a single location of final collapse, reinforcing the idea that the crew had continued to struggle long after leaving the ships behind. These findings, though fragmentary, offered glimpses into the physical reality of their journey, even as they left larger questions unresolved. Through the accounts preserved in Inuit oral histories, a narrative emerged describing abandoned ships and crew members travelling across the ice, observations that would later provide crucial context to the locations where wreckage and remains were found. These accounts, passed down through generations, described encounters with starving men pulling sleds and carrying supplies as they moved across the frozen terrain. Some accounts also referenced abandoned ships frozen in place, aligning with the eventual discovery of the wreck sites many years later. While such testimonies were initially overlooked by early search efforts, they would later prove invaluable in guiding modern researchers toward understanding the expedition's path. The integration of oral history with archaeological evidence has since become a critical component in reconstructing the sequence of events, bridging the gap between documented exploration and lived experience. Beneath the surface of the surrounding Arctic waters, modern underwater surveys eventually identified the long-sought wrecks, confirming the resting places of both ships while simultaneously deepening the unanswered questions surrounding their final hours. In 2014, the wreck of HMS Erebus was discovered in Wilmot and Crampton Bay, followed by the discovery of HMS Terror in Terror Bay in 2016, both remarkably preserved in the cold, low-oxygen environment. The condition of the wrecks revealed structural details that had remained intact for over a century, allowing researchers to examine the ships as they were when they were abandoned. The positioning of the vessels suggested deliberate abandonment rather than sudden destruction, though certain damage patterns raised questions about the forces that may have acted upon them. These discoveries marked a turning point in the investigation, transforming the mystery from a matter of location into a matter of interpretation. As researchers examined the recovered artifacts and structural damage, attention turned to the possibility that environmental forces, shifting ice, and prolonged entrapment had combined to create conditions that no 19th century vessel could have survived intact. Some evidence suggested that the ships had been crushed or breached by ice pressure, while other findings pointed to gradual abandonment as resources dwindled and conditions worsened. The Arctic environment, with its extreme temperatures and dynamic ice formations, can exert immense force on stationary objects, compressing and fracturing even reinforced hulls over time. This interplay between environment and human endurance remains central to understanding the fate of the expedition, as it highlights the limits of even the most prepared ventures into polar regions. Yet despite these insights, the precise sequence of events remains only partially reconstructed, leaving room for continued analysis and debate. In the decades that followed, continued analysis of the expedition's remains, coupled with historical records and newly recovered evidence, revealed patterns that hinted at the crew's final movements across an unforgiving landscape. Examination of skeletal remains found on King William Island revealed signs consistent with extreme hardship, including malnutrition and possible exposure to lead, a factor that has been widely studied in relation to the expedition's preserved food supplies. The distribution of remains and artifacts suggested a gradual dispersal rather than a single catastrophic event, indicating that the crew may have split into smaller groups as conditions deteriorated. These findings align with earlier accounts describing overland travel, reinforcing the notion that survival depended on movement, even in the face of diminishing resources. Each new piece of evidence contributes to a broader understanding, yet the full story remains elusive, fragmented across time and terrain. Even with modern technology providing clearer views of the wreck sites, the precise sequence of events leading to the loss of the expedition remains only partially understood, preserved in fragments that resist full reconstruction. Advanced imaging and underwater exploration have allowed researchers to map sections of the ships in detail, offering insight into their final condition and orientation. However, key questions persist, including the exact timing of the ship's abandonment, the circumstances surrounding the crew's decision to leave, and the ultimate fate of those who attempted to walk away from the ice. The Arctic has preserved much, but it has also obscured just enough to prevent a complete narrative from forming. What remains is a collection of verified facts, each one pointing toward a larger story that has yet to be fully told. What endures, however, is not only the location of the ships, but the silence that still surrounds the final choices made by those who never returned. The strange case of the MV Taiqing 21. Commercial fishing operations in the Pacific often follow predictable routes and routines shaped by weather patterns, catch distribution, and vessel endurance. Yet the discovery of the MV Taiqing 21 introduced a deviation from that familiarity that would later draw sustained investigative attention. The vessel, a long-line fishing ship operating in international waters, was found adrift and heavily damaged by fire, its condition immediately signalling that something had interrupted its operations in a manner that left little room for orderly explanation. Reports from the time of its discovery describe a ship that had not simply drifted into disrepair, but one that had been transformed by heat and time into a hollow structure marked by destruction. Its presence in open waters, without a functioning crew and without clear signs of distress, placed it among a category of maritime cases that resist immediate classification. The Pacific, vast and heavily trafficked, still holds space for anomalies such as this, where a working vessel becomes a silent artifact of its final moments. Evidence retrieved from the vessel's remains revealed a hull scarred by extensive fire damage, with structural components reduced to charred remnants that suggested prolonged exposure to intense heat rather than a brief isolated incident. Sections of the superstructure bore clear signs of combustion, with metal surfaces warped and coatings stripped away by sustained burning. The extent of the damage indicated that the fire had been significant enough to alter the physical integrity of the vessel, yet not so absolute as to consume it entirely, leaving behind a partially intact framework. Such patterns of destruction are often examined to determine the origin and behaviour of onboard fires, as the way materials burn can reveal the conditions under which the fire developed. In this case, however, the available evidence offered only partial insight, as the irregular nature of the damage did not align neatly with a single clearly defined source. Among the more unsettling details documented in reports was the apparent absence of the crew, as no human remains were recovered alongside the vessel, leaving behind only traces of their presence and the sudden void of their disappearance. Fishing vessels operating in the Pacific typically carry crews who live and work in close quarters, making their absence particularly notable in the context of an abandoned ship. Life aboard such vessels leaves behind a consistent pattern of occupation. Personal items, tools and equipment arranged for daily use. Yet in this case, those indicators were fragmented or missing entirely. The lack of any confirmed distress signals or recovery of crew members deepened the uncertainty surrounding their final actions. Whether they abandoned the vessel intentionally, were forced to evacuate under extreme conditions, or encountered circumstances that prevented communication remains unconfirmed within the available records. Close examination of the cargo areas indicated that some materials remained largely untouched by fire, an observation that introduced a quiet inconsistency when compared to the extent of damage visible elsewhere on the ship. In maritime incidents involving fire, it is not uncommon for certain compartments to experience varying levels of damage, depending on airflow, materials stored, and the direction of flame spread. However, the preservation of select cargo elements raised questions about how the fire progressed and whether it followed an expected pattern. Such inconsistencies can sometimes point to external factors influencing the fire's behaviour, or to the possibility that parts of the vessel were secured or isolated at the time of the incident. The condition of these areas added another layer to the case, suggesting that the fire may not have affected the entire vessel uniformly. Within the broader context of maritime safety and emergency protocol, the lack of recorded distress signals or confirmed communication prior to the vessel's discovery stands out as a critical gap in understanding the timeline of events. Modern fishing vessels are typically equipped with communication systems designed to transmit distress in the event of emergencies, including fire or structural damage. The absence of such signals in this case implies that either the situation developed too rapidly for communication, or that the systems themselves were compromised before they could be used. This absence creates a break in the expected chain of events, leaving a void where a critical piece of information would normally exist. Without it, the reconstruction of the vessel's final hours relies entirely on physical evidence and indirect inference. Further analysis of the burn patterns across the deck and interior spaces suggested that the fire may have followed an irregular progression, potentially influenced by environmental conditions or onboard materials that affected how the flames spread. Fire behaviour on ships can be shaped by numerous factors, including wind direction, fuel sources and structural layout, all of which contribute to how quickly and extensively a fire develops. In this case, the distribution of damage appeared uneven, with some areas showing deep charring while others retained elements of their original structure. This unevenness complicates efforts to identify a singular point of origin, as it suggests that the fire may have evolved dynamically rather than following a predictable path. Each variation in damage becomes a clue, though not one that leads to a definitive conclusion. From a structural standpoint, the vessel's design, typical of long-line fishing ships operating in open waters, would have included safety measures intended to contain or delay fire, making the scale of destruction all the more notable in comparison. These vessels are constructed with compartments and materials intended to limit the spread of onboard hazards, allowing crews time to respond in emergency situations. The presence of such features makes the extent of fire damage more difficult to reconcile, as it implies that either the fire exceeded the ship's protective design, or that these systems were no longer effective when the incident occurred. Understanding this discrepancy requires considering both the physical limitations of the vessel and the conditions under which it was operating at the time. The balance between design and destruction becomes a central point of analysis, though it does not yield a complete answer. Investigative records compiled after the discovery focused on reconstructing the sequence of events leading up to the abandonment, yet the limited physical evidence prevented a complete and definitive timeline from being established. Without witness accounts or recovered communications, investigators were left to interpret the available data through observation and comparison to similar incidents. Each piece of evidence contributed to a partial narrative, but none provided a full account of how the situation unfolded. This limitation is common in maritime investigations, particularly when vessels are found after extended periods at sea, as environmental factors can alter or erase critical details. In this case, the passage of time between the incident and its discovery further reduced the possibility of recovering definitive answers. So even as fragments of information were assembled through inspection and analysis, the absence of witnesses or surviving communications ensured that many aspects of the vessel's final hours remained outside the reach of certainty. The Pacific Ocean, vast and unpredictable, often preserves just enough evidence to suggest what may have occurred, while withholding the details that would confirm it. The Taiqing 21 stands as one such example, where the physical remains tell part of the story, but not enough to complete it. Its condition invites examination, yet resists resolution, leaving investigators and observers with more questions than answers. The fire that consumed parts of the vessel is documented, but the sequence of events leading to that moment remains undefined. The fire left its mark on every surface it touched, yet the moments that led to it remain absent from every record that followed. The disappearance of the SS Poet. Cargo records and navigation logs placed the SS Poet on a routine transoceanic route in 1980. Yet somewhere along that passage, the vessel encountered conditions that would interrupt its journey and remove it from every subsequent report. The ship, a bulk cargo carrier, was part of a system designed around predictable movement, scheduled departures, recorded positions, and communication points that allowed its progress to be tracked across vast distances. Yet within that structure, the final trace of the vessel remains incomplete, as though the documentation itself stopped short of the moment when the ship ceased to exist within the network of records that defined its voyage. Its disappearance is not framed by a single catastrophic image or confirmed event, but by the absence of continuity, a break in the chain of information that typically follows a vessel from departure to arrival. Voyage documentation indicates that the ship maintained its scheduled course until contact was abruptly reduced, leaving a narrow window in which the final hours of the vessel must be inferred rather than confirmed. In maritime operations, such gaps are not entirely uncommon, particularly when vessels pass through regions of heavy weather or communication limitations, yet in most cases, contact resumes or is restored through alternative channels. In this instance, however, the absence persisted, and no subsequent updates were recorded to clarify the vessel's status or condition. The narrowing of information into a single unresolved interval transforms the final segment of the ship's journey into a void within the timeline, where only inference remains. What should have been a sequence of navigational entries instead becomes a point of silence, marked not by data, but by its absence. Communications attributed to the SS Poet ceased without a clearly recorded distress transmission, a detail that distinguishes the case from typical maritime emergencies where at least partial signals are preserved. Distress signals, whether automatic or manually transmitted, are designed to provide immediate indication of a vessel's situation, even in rapidly deteriorating conditions. The absence of such a signal raises questions about the timing and nature of the events that unfolded on board. as it suggests that either the situation developed too quickly for communication or that systems were compromised before they could be used. This gap in communication creates a boundary in the investigation, beyond which the actions of the crew and the condition of the vessel remain unverified. Without that critical point of contact, the final moments remain inaccessible, preserved only in the absence of transmission. Shipping protocols of the period required consistent reporting intervals, yet the absence of expected updates from the vessel suggests a disruption that occurred faster than standard procedures could account for. These protocols are not merely administrative, they function as a safety framework, allowing authorities to track a vessel's position and respond if communication ceases unexpectedly. When those intervals pass without confirmation, it typically triggers a series of responses designed to locate or re-establish contact with the ship. In the case of the SS Poet, however, the expected pattern of escalation appears to have been met with no confirming data from the vessel itself. This deviation from protocol marks a shift from routine operation to uncertainty, where the absence of communication becomes the defining feature of the case. Weather analyses conducted after the disappearance identified storm activity in the region, though the precise impact of those conditions on the ship remains a matter of reconstruction rather than direct observation. Storms at sea can generate powerful winds and waves capable of altering a vessel's course, damaging structural components or disrupting navigation systems. However, without direct accounts or recorded data from the ship itself, the exact conditions it encountered must be inferred from broader meteorological patterns. These reconstructions provide context, but not certainty, leaving open the question of how the vessel responded to the environment around it. The storm, while significant, remains only one element within a broader set of unknowns that define the ship's final moments. Search operations initiated following the vessel's loss covered extensive areas of the ocean, but yielded no confirmed debris field that could be definitively linked to the ship. In maritime investigations, the discovery of wreckage often provides critical clues about the nature of a vessel's disappearance, including the force of impact, the direction of drift, and the conditions at the time of loss. The absence of such evidence in this case complicates efforts to establish a clear narrative, as it removes one of the primary means of reconstructing maritime incidents. Despite thorough efforts, the ocean revealed no conclusive remnants that could be tied directly to the SS Poet, leaving the search without a physical anchor point from which to draw conclusions. Records from maritime authorities document the deployment of available search resources at the time, reflecting the urgency with which the vessel's disappearance was treated, despite the lack of immediate evidence. Aircraft, ships, and coordinated search patterns were utilised in an attempt to locate the missing vessel or any trace of its passage. These efforts, conducted over a significant area, were consistent with established procedures for responding to missing ships, particularly those carrying cargo and operating within known routes. Yet despite this coordinated response, the search did not produce the expected outcomes. The absence of results does not indicate a lack of effort, but rather underscores the scale of the challenge posed by the ocean itself. Comparisons with similar cases reveal that even in severe storm-related losses, fragments of wreckage are typically recovered, making the complete absence of material evidence in this case particularly notable. The ocean, while vast, often leaves behind subtle indicators, floating debris, oil slicks, or structural fragments, that can guide investigators toward understanding what occurred. In the case of the SS Poet, such indicators were either not present or not identified, creating a scenario where the usual pathways of investigation are unavailable. This absence of physical trace sets the case apart, emphasizing not only the loss of the vessel, but the disappearance of its physical footprint within the ocean environment. With each investigative layer, the known details narrow rather than expand, forming a record defined less by what was found and more by what remained absent. The structure of the case is shaped by these gaps, where each missing element contributes to the overall uncertainty. The ship's final position, the condition of its hull, and the actions of its crew all remain unresolved, creating a narrative composed of incomplete segments. In the absence of closure, the case persists as a collection of documented silences, each one reinforcing the limits of what can be known through available evidence. The trail ends not with impact or wreckage, but with a route that simply stopped being traceable. The ghostly return of the Jenny. A schooner operating under the name Jenny was documented within maritime accounts as part of routine seafaring activity, its early presence recorded in the same structured manner expected of vessels engaged in long-distance navigation. The initial descriptions position the ship within a defined route, where movement, weather and progress were tracked with consistency, reflecting established practices of the period. These early notations also align with the broader conventions of maritime reporting, where accuracy in position and condition was essential not only for navigation, but for maintaining a verifiable account of the vessel's journey across open water. Within the earliest preserved entries, the vessel's movement appears steady and deliberate, with each notation reinforcing the expectation of continuity across open water. Positions were marked with a level of precision that suggests normal operation, and nothing within the early record indicates deviation from standard maritime procedure. At this stage, the consistency of the entries suggests a vessel functioning within expected parameters, with no irregularities in timing, location or description that might indicate strain or disruption. As the sequence of entries continues, the structure of the writing begins to shift in subtle ways, with certain observations shortened or omitted, leaving behind a more compressed form of documentation. The changes do not present as abrupt disruption, but instead emerge gradually, altering the texture of the narrative without immediately breaking its continuity. What becomes notable here is not the absence of information itself, but the manner in which the documentation begins to conserve detail, as though each entry is required to serve a narrower purpose than those that came before it. Over time, the intervals between recorded positions appear to widen, creating gaps that interrupt the otherwise steady progression of the voyage. These gaps, when examined in sequence, suggest that the vessel experienced conditions that limited its ability to maintain consistent reporting, though the entries themselves do not explicitly explain the cause. Such spacing in maritime logs can indicate a range of factors, including restricted movement, environmental interference, or limitations in observation, yet the absence of clarification leaves the interpretation unresolved within the record itself. In later entries, the language becomes more constrained, focusing less on broader navigation and more on immediate surroundings. The scope of each observation narrows, and the descriptions begin to centre on what can be directly perceived from the vessel itself, rather than its relation to the larger route. This shift reflects a transition in perspective, where the documentation no longer supports an outward-looking account of travel but instead records only what remains within immediate reach of perception. The pattern of documentation continues to evolve, with repetition becoming more apparent across consecutive entries. This repetition, rather than signalling error, reflects a reduced range of observation, as if the vessel's perspective had narrowed to a limited set of conditions that remained unchanged over time. Repeated phrasing and recurring details in maritime records can indicate a stabilization of conditions, yet in this context, the repetition contributes to a sense that the range of observable reality has itself become constrained. Maritime documentation from similar periods indicates that such shifts can occur when vessels are subjected to prolonged isolation, where environmental constraints and limited resources influence both movement and reporting. The entries attributed to this schooner align with that pattern, though no explicit explanation is provided within the text itself. In comparable cases, such changes in documentation are often accompanied by physical or environmental pressures that restrict the ability to maintain standard reporting, though the exact nature of those pressures remains unrecorded in this instance. Historical accounts that reference the schooner's later condition describe its discovery in a frozen state, with its structure preserved in a way that contrasts sharply with the gradual narrowing of its written record. The physical evidence, as described in these accounts, provides a static conclusion to a narrative that had already begun to contract within the entries. The preservation of the vessel in such a condition introduces a point of tension between the physical artifact and the written record, as one appears fixed, while the other reveals a gradual reduction in scope. Further examination of the preserved documentation reveals that the final entries maintain the same constrained tone found in the preceding records. There is no marked conclusion within the writing itself, only a continuation of the established pattern, as though the act of recording had reached its natural limit. The absence of a defined ending within the text suggests that the process of documentation did not conclude in a conventional sense, but instead ceased without formal closure, leaving the final entry to stand as the last known point of articulation. Taken together, the sequence of entries forms a continuous record that begins with standard navigation and gradually transitions into a restricted account defined by repetition and limitation. Each entry contributes to a broader progression that moves from expansion toward contraction, reflecting a narrowing scope of observation over time. This progression, when viewed as a whole, presents not a single moment of change, but a gradual transformation in the nature of the record itself, where the act of documenting becomes increasingly confined. The preserved accounts do not offer a direct explanation for the vessel's final state, leaving the sequence of events to be interpreted through the structure of the entries themselves. What remains is a record that documents its own gradual reduction, rather than the moment it ended. In this way, the absence of explanation becomes a defining feature of the narrative, shifting the focus from what occurred to how little the record is ultimately able to reveal. The final entry remains intact, yet everything that followed exists only in the absence it leaves behind. The unresolved mystery of the Salem Express survivors. The Salem Express, a ferry originally built in 1965, was far from new when it made its fateful voyage across the Red Sea. While still operational, questions lingered about the vessel's maintenance and whether it had undergone the necessary checks to ensure its safety. Some reports suggested that the ship had been running with minimal repairs, with rumours circulating among the crew about the vessel's mechanical reliability. Yet these concerns were rarely addressed publicly, and no substantial evidence was ever provided to confirm whether poor maintenance played a role in the sinking. Was the Salem Express simply a victim of time and wear, or was it doomed by a series of unacknowledged faults? When investigators finally examined the scene of the wreck, the official reports were unclear and contradictory. The Salem Express had collided with the reef at a high speed, yet the precise cause of the collision remained a mystery. Some suggested that the captain, under pressure to meet tight schedules, may have been negligent. Others pointed to the crew's lack of experience with the route, or even faulty navigation equipment. But none of these theories ever gained definitive support, and the lack of clarity from official channels only amplified the uncertainty surrounding the disaster. What seemed like a simple maritime incident, one involving the loss of a ferry, soon morphed into a complex web of unsubstantiated claims. The survivors who were rescued from the disaster, many clinging to bits of wreckage or found far from the sinking site, did not all share the same recollections of the ship's final moments. Some described hearing frantic screams, while others reported eerie silence, as if the chaos of the sinking had swallowed sound itself. A few survivors recalled seeing passengers jumping overboard long before the ship had fully sunk, leading investigators to wonder if panic had set in much earlier than anticipated. Why then did the survivors' recollections differ so drastically? Was the trauma of the event clouding their memories? Or was there something far more sinister at play that remained hidden from view? Theories about the sinking, rather than clarifying the mystery, seem to only deepen it. Some have suggested a cover-up involving the Egyptian authorities or the ferry's owners, though no concrete evidence has ever surfaced to substantiate these claims. Were there attempts to suppress certain details in order to protect the shipping company's reputation, or to shield officials from blame? The reluctance of the authorities to release certain documents only fed into the growing speculation, leaving many to wonder if there was more to the sinking than the public was ever told. In the aftermath, the Salem Express was declared to have sunk at an alarming speed, a ship gone beneath the waves in less than an hour. Was there an unexpected factor that caused the rapid descent, such as an undetected breach in the hull? Or did the ferry's overloading contribute to its instability? Official reports never quite agreed on the extent to which the vessel's condition played a role, and the wreckage provided few clues. The Red Sea, while giving up the remains of the ship, kept its secrets deep beneath the waves. Only fragments of the truth could be gleaned from survivors' accounts and the wreckage itself, leaving the full story tragically untold. Despite the passage of time, the case of the Salem Express remains an enigma, its full story locked away in a maze of conflicting accounts and incomplete reports. What happened that night in the Red Sea, and what really caused the ferry to sink? The truth remains buried in the waters, waiting to be unearthed, but it seems less likely with each passing year. The truth of the Salem Express lies buried beneath layers of conflicting testimonies and unanswered questions, forever lost to the depths of the Red Sea,